If this is your first time here, the channel has more. The complete Warhammer 40K story and more games, all narrated slowly for nights like this one. Subscribe to Midnight Lore, and let's begin. Get comfortable. Let the world outside go quiet. This story begins 65 million years ago, not thousands, not millions in the vague geological sense. 65 million years before the 41st millennium, before the Imperium, before humanity had even learned to walk upright on the planet that would one day be called Terra. There was already a war in this galaxy, a war of such devastating scale that its consequences are still being felt in every corner of known space. A war that created most of the intelligent species you will encounter in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and that poisoned the dimension through which those species would eventually travel. This is the war in heaven, and before we can understand it, we need to understand who was fighting it. The Old Ones came first. They were an ancient species, possibly reptilian, possibly something that does not fit neatly into any biological category we have words for, whose civilization had reached its height more than 60 million years before the current era. They were masters of both advanced technology and psychic power. They had created or discovered the webway, an extra-dimensional network of tunnels and passages that allowed travel between distant points in space without passing through the warp, the chaotic psychic dimension that underlies physical reality. The webway was one of the most significant technological achievements in the history of the galaxy, and for a very long time, it gave the Old Ones a mobility and reach that no other species could match. The Old Ones were not simply powerful. They were generous with their power in a specific way. They traveled the galaxy and seeded worlds with life. They cultivated intelligence. They guided the development of other species, nurturing the development of beings who would eventually become significant players in the galaxy's history. The Aeldari, the species that would later be called Eldar by the humans of the Imperium, were created or significantly advanced by the Old Ones, becoming their most favored servants and students. The Krork, the primitive ancestors of what would one day degenerate into Orks, were engineered as biological weapons, warrior organisms designed with the specific purpose of fighting. Various other species were shaped, guided, or created outright by the Old Ones in the course of their long stewardship of the galaxy. And then there were the Necrontyr. The Necrontyr were a humanoid species, an ancient even by the standards of a galaxy that measures its history in millions of years. They lived in the Halo Stars region, the far edges of the galaxy, where the stars are sparse and old and dangerous. Their sun was specifically unkind to them. It bombarded their homeworld with radiation that produced a civilization of people who died young, who suffered constantly from radiation-related diseases, who watched their bodies decay while other species lived long and sometimes immortal lives. The Necrontyr were brilliant and bitter and desperately, obsessively aware of their own mortality. They found the Old Ones and asked for immortality. This was not an unreasonable request. The Old Ones had the knowledge and the capability to extend lives, to address biological limitations, and to grant the kind of longevity that they had given to other species they favored. The Necrontyr wanted what the Aeldari had. They wanted what the Old Ones themselves possessed. the Old Ones refused. The specific reason for the refusal is not entirely clear from the surviving records, which are fragmentary and heavily filtered through later perspectives that are not neutral on the subject. Perhaps the Old Ones judged the Necronter unworthy. Perhaps they saw in the Necronter something that made them reluctant to grant the power that immortality represents. Perhaps they simply had no interest in cultivating another species and expressed this with the casual dismissiveness of beings who are very, very old, dealing with beings who are comparatively new. Whatever the reason, the refusal created in the Necronter a hatred that their radiation-shortened lives fermented into something absolute. They declared war on the Old Ones. They lost. They were driven back to their dying sun and their poisoned world and their endless dying. And the hatred they had been building was joined by humiliation and the specific fury of people who have been dismissed. And then they found the Citan. The Citan are among the oldest beings in the universe, entities of pure energy who had formed at the very dawn of creation, in the first moments after the universe itself came into existence, when the stars were young and roiling and the lines of electromagnetic force produced by plasma flares created the conditions for the first self-aware beings to emerge. They were not alive in any biological sense. They were patterns of energy, feeding on the electromagnetic output of stars, vast and ancient, and completely without morality in any form that a living creature would recognize. For billions of years, the Citan drifted through the cosmos as beings of pure energy, feeding on stellar radiation, essentially inert from the perspective of any biological civilization. They were aware, in their way. They had hungers, but they had no bodies, no ability to interact with the material universe in any direct sense. They were observers or feeders or simply presences, depending on how generously you choose to characterize entities that did not, at that point, do anything either good or terrible. The Necronter changed all of that through processes that involved extraordinary scientific achievement, the construction of bodies from a material called necrodermis, a living metal of extraordinary properties. The Necronter gave the Citan physical form. They coaxed the star entities into these new bodies, these solid and manipulable forms, and in doing so transformed the Citan from drifting cosmic presences into something that could act in the world. The Citan, now embodied, developed new hungers. The electromagnetic energy of stars was no longer sufficient. They discovered that the biological energy of living creatures, the specific electromagnetic and psychic signature of organic life, was far more potent, far more satisfying than anything they had fed on before. They began to feed on the Necronter, who had given them their bodies. One of the Citan, the entity that would come to be called the Deceiver, for reasons that will become clear, approached the Silent King, had the ruler of the Necronter Triarch with an offer. The Citan would give the Necronter what the Old Ones had refused, immortality. Through biotransference, the transfer of Necronter consciousness into bodies of necrodermis, the same living metal that housed the Citan themselves, the Necronter would live forever. The Silent King accepted. Whether he fully understood the terms of the arrangement, whether he grasped that the Citan, in transferring Necronter consciousness into metal, would also consume the souls of the Necronter, the essence of what they actually were. is a question that the surviving records of the Necron dynasties debate without resolution. What is certain is that biotransference happened. The Necrontyr entered their machines. They became the Necrons, and they found that immortality, and when you arrive at it by giving up everything that makes you a person, is not what you imagined it would be. The Necrons were undying. Their metal bodies could be repaired, rebuilt, restored from any damage short of total annihilation. They did not age. They did not suffer from radiation. They would last as long as the stars themselves, potentially longer. Every material desire the Necrontyr had expressed in their demand for immortality was satisfied. They had no souls. The C'tan had consumed them during the process of biotransference, taken the psychic essence that made each Necrontyr a specific individual with specific memories and specific feelings and a specific way of being in the world, and fed on it. What remained in the metal bodies were the cognitive processes, the intelligence, the personality in a functional sense, the capacity for thought, but stripped of the deeper quality that connected them to the warp, to the psychic dimension that serves as the afterlife for most biological creatures. The Necrons could think and plan and fight. They could not dream. They could not feel in the way that they had once felt, and most of them, in time, would lose even the cognitive structures that made them individuals, fading into automata as the eons of immortal existence wore away the last traces of what they had been. The war in heaven resumed, now with the Necrons and C'tan fighting together against the Old Ones. The scale of the conflict exceeded anything the galaxy had seen before or has seen since. Planets were destroyed, stars were extinguished. Entire systems were consumed by artificial black holes that the C'tan called into being as weapons. The Old Ones, for all their technological and psychic power, were being pushed back. In response, the Old Ones made a desperate decision. They created warrior species, engineered races designed specifically for combat, psychically empowered in ways that would make them effective against the C'tan, whose specific weakness was psychic energy. The Aeldari were refined and enhanced into a warrior civilization of extraordinary capability. The Krog were mass-produced in vast quantities, biological weapons that reproduced through spores that could grow from nothing in the ruins of destroyed civilizations, that were engineered to be perpetually ready for violence. These species fought. The tide of the war shifted. And then something happened that neither the Old Ones nor the C'tan had fully anticipated. The warp, the psychic dimension that the Old Ones had used so freely, the dimension through which their psychic powers flowed and their webway gates connected, was being changed by the war. Every death in the war in heaven produced psychic echoes in the warp. Every soul that was consumed by the C'tan, every mind that was burned out in combat, every wave of terror and suffering that the war generated, all of this accumulated in the warp, changing its fundamental character. The warp had once been relatively stable, a psychic mirror of the physical universe that could be navigated and used. Under the weight of the war in heaven's carnage, it became something else. It began to fill with entities, beings composed of psychic energy, fueled by the emotional residue of billions of deaths, and capable of acting in the warp, and increasingly capable of crossing into the physical universe. The enslavers appeared. warp entities that could take control of psychers, the psychically gifted beings that the Old Ones had engineered into their warrior species, and use those bodies to tear holes in the fabric of reality, letting more warp entities through. The Old Ones had armed their species with psychic power specifically because it was effective against the C'tan. They had not anticipated that this power would also make those species vulnerable to beings from the warp that were becoming more powerful and more numerous with every year of the war. The Old Ones were defeated. Whether they were destroyed entirely or simply fled the galaxy to some place where the war's consequences could not reach them is one of the great mysteries of Warhammer 40,000's cosmology. They simply ceased to be present. The most ancient and powerful civilization the galaxy had produced vanished, leaving behind only their engineered species and the ruins of their civilization. With the Old Ones gone and the C'tan triumphant, the Necrons completed the war. And then the Silent King, Zarek, who had agreed to biotransference and had watched what it had done to his people, turned on the C'tan. The Necrons were, if nothing else, extraordinary engineers, and they had been studying the C'tan for the entire duration of the war. They knew how the star gods functioned. They knew how to hurt them, using weapons of extraordinary sophistication, tesseract technology capable of containing vast amounts of energy. The Necrons shattered the C'tan. The great star gods were broken into fragments. The fragments, called C'tan shards, were captured and contained, sealed in tesseract vaults, where they could be used as living weapons or power sources, but could never regain their full cosmic power. The galaxy, at this point, was a ruin. The enslavers were everywhere. The Aeldari were scattered and struggling. The Krork were degenerating, already beginning the slow slide toward the species they would eventually become. Life was present in fragments, but the great civilization of the Old Ones was gone, and nothing had yet risen to replace it. The Silent King made a calculation. The enslavers would eventually fade, as warp entities do when their sustaining emotional energy diminishes. The galaxy would eventually recover. New life would evolve. New civilizations would emerge. And when they did, the Necrons, sleeping in their tomb worlds, maintained by machines over the millions of years of their hibernation, would awaken to claim what the war in heaven had cost them so much to win. 60 million Necron warriors entered stasis on thousands of tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy. The Silent King set their timers and departed, beginning a solitary journey through the stars. The galaxy lay quiet. The enslavers fed and died, and the warp slowly stabilized, not into what it had been, but into something that could be endured. And life began again, unguided this time, evolving without the Old Ones to shape and nurture it. On one unremarkable world, among countless unremarkable worlds, the ancestors of humanity were learning to stand upright. The Aeldari Empire rose in the silence, gifted with psychic power by the Old Ones' engineering, inheritors of the webway, masters of technologies that the departing Old Ones had left behind. The Aeldari built a civilization that dominated the galaxy for millions of years. They were everything the Old Ones had hoped their children might become. Powerful, long-lived, subtle, capable of extraordinary artistry and extraordinary violence in equal measure. Their empire connected millions of worlds through the webway. Their craftsmen produced works of beauty that have never been surpassed. Their psychers could predict the future, shape reality, and communicate across the vast distances of space with a facility that no other species has matched before or since. And they fell. Not to an external enemy, not to the Necrons awakening from their sleep or the Citan shards escaping their containment. They fell to themselves, to the specific corruption that comes from having too much for too long, with too little consequence. Segments of Aeldari society, freed from all material need by their civilization's extraordinary capabilities, began to pursue sensation for its own sake. First pleasure, then excess, then depravity, then something that doesn't have a clean word in human languages, the pursuit of experience so extreme that it consumed everything around it. These Aeldari were feeding something in the warp without knowing it. Every extreme emotion generates psychic energy. Every soul produces ripples in the psychic dimension. The Aeldari, who were naturally more psychically sensitive than any other species, were generating enormous quantities of psychic energy through their excesses. In the warp, the accumulation of this energy was producing something, a gestalt, a being assembled from the collective psychic residue of millions of Aeldari lives, lived at extremes of sensation. It was not born quickly. It took millennia, but it was inevitable, in the way that any process is inevitable when the conditions for it are present and accumulating. On a day that the surviving Aeldari remember as the Fall, the most catastrophic single event in the history of their species, the Gestalt achieved consciousness. A new Chaos God was born in the warp. The Aeldari knew it as Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, the entity of excess and desire that their civilization had accidentally assembled from the psychic resonance of their own corruption. The birth scream of a god, the psychic shockwave of that impossible event, tore through the warp and through the Aeldari Empire simultaneously. Most of the Aeldari died in that moment. Their souls, naturally attuned to the warp, were pulled towards Slaanesh and consumed. The Aeldari homeworlds were destroyed. Their empire collapsed. The psychic wound torn by Slaanesh's birth became a permanent feature of the warp and of real space. The Eye of Terror, a vast region where the barrier between the physical universe and the warp has been permanently destroyed, where demons walk in physical space and the laws of physics mean nothing. Some Aeldari survived, those who had retreated from the excess before the fall, who had maintained the discipline of the paths, who had rejected what their civilization was becoming, fled on great craft world ships, enormous mobile habitats that became the homes of the craft world Aeldari. Others had retreated into the webway, founding the hidden cities that became Komorra, the Dark City of what would eventually be called the Drukhari. Others still had abandoned the empire to follow different paths, the Exodites who had colonized distant worlds, or the Harlequins who served the laughing god Kegarach, the only surviving Aeldari deity. The galaxy was changed again. The Eye of Terror was a new wound in reality that would never fully heal. The Aeldari were broken, a species of survivors rather than an empire. And humanity, which had been evolving in the background of all these events, was about to enter the stage. On Terra, something extraordinary had been happening for a very long time. The shamans of ancient humanity, the psychers, the gifted individuals who could touch the warp with their minds, had understood something important. They had communicated with each other across time and death, in the way that strong warp presences can communicate when they choose to pay attention. And they had come to a collective understanding of a terrible truth. The process of reincarnation, through which human souls naturally return to physical existence through the warp, was being disrupted. Demons in the warp were consuming human souls before they could complete the journey back to life. Humanity's spiritual continuity was being slowly eaten away by entities that had existed since the war in heaven, and that human civilization was not yet sophisticated enough to resist. The shamans devised a solution of extraordinary audacity. Thousands of them, across many generations, coordinating through the warp itself, orchestrated a mass ritual suicide. Each shaman was a significant psychic presence. Each possessed enough warp energy to reincarnate. By combining their deaths, by merging their thousands of souls in a coordinated act of collective self-sacrifice, they could produce something that no individual soul could become. A being of such extraordinary psychic magnitude that it could incarnate as a single physical person and persist across deaths, reincarnating in the same body, rather than cycling through the normal process. And they made the emperor of mankind, not a god, not a being from outside humanity, a man, but a man assembled from the merged psychic essences of thousands of the greatest human souls that had ever lived, born into a physical body in a specific time and place, carrying within him the accumulated wisdom and power of every shaman who had given their existence to his creation. He was born around 8,000 years before the current era, in the region of central Anatolia on Old Earth. He was the most powerful psyker who had ever lived. He was, in his physical form, essentially immortal, capable of healing from any wound, regenerating from any damage, persisting through circumstances that would destroy any normal human being. And he was, from the moment of his birth, already aware of what he was and what he would need to become. He took a very long time. The Emperor lived through the entirety of human prehistory and history on Terra, taking different roles, guiding humanity in ways that the historical record mostly cannot distinguish from the natural processes of cultural development. He was a wanderer, a philosopher, a king, a general, a teacher, never revealing his full nature, never allowing himself to be worshipped, always working toward the long goal of preparing humanity for what he knew was coming. What he knew was coming was the warp, the chaos that the war in heaven had unleashed into the psychic dimension was not contained to that dimension. It had been seeping into the physical universe for 60 million years. The entities that lived in the warp, the demons, the chaos gods, the vast and terrible presences that had formed from the psychic residue of countless billions of deaths, were not passive. They were hungry. They were active. And humanity, the most numerous psychically active species in the galaxy, was the most attractive target they had ever encountered. The Emperor looked at humanity's future and understood that without intervention, without a centralized power capable of protecting humanity from the warp and from its own worst impulses, the species would be consumed. The demons would find their way in. The chaos gods, who had been growing in power since the war in heaven, and who had received a catastrophic boost from Slanesh's birth, would break through the barriers between dimensions. Humanity would end, not in war with an external enemy, but from the inside out, through the corruption of the warp that flows through every human psyche. He had a plan. It was, by any standard of ambition, extraordinary. He would unite all of humanity. He would build an empire that could resist the warp. He would create warriors who could fight the enemies that normal humans could not fight. He would guide the species toward a future where it was safe from the things that waited in the dark between the stars. He began on Terra. The Unification Wars were the first step, the campaigns through which the Emperor, emerging from his long anonymity, began to conquer the fractured nation-states and techno-barbarian kingdoms of a Terra that had been devastated by millennia of wars and the collapse of its previous civilizations. He used armies of Thunder Warriors, his first attempts at creating enhanced soldiers, to establish dominance. He built alliances with the Mechanicum of Mars, the techno-priests who had preserved the knowledge of ancient technology in their enormous factory temples, securing an alliance that would provide him with the industrial capacity his ambitions required. And then, in secret, in facilities that no one outside his most trusted circle was permitted to enter, he began work on something that would define the next 10,000 years of galactic history. The Primarchs. Sleep well. The Great Crusade is almost here, and everything that follows is both the greatest achievement and the greatest catastrophe in human history. Welcome back. Let everything slow around you. In the last part, we covered 65 million years of galactic prehistory, the war in heaven, the birth and fall of the Aeldari Empire, and the emergence of the Emperor on Terra. We ended with the Emperor beginning work on something that would define the rest of human history. Now we arrive at the Primarchs. The Emperor created them in secret, deep beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, in gene laboratories that no one outside his most trusted circle was permitted to approach. He engineered 20 beings from his own genetic material. They were his sons, in a meaningful, if not conventional, biological sense, each one constructed from a different combination of his traits. Each one designed to embody a specific aspect of war and leadership and human excellence. And the Primarchs were not simply enhanced humans. They were something categorically different from anything that had existed before. They were superhuman in every measurable way. Larger than any normal human, stronger, faster, capable of processing information at speeds that made even the most brilliant, unenhanced minds look sluggish by comparison. They healed from wounds that would kill anything less than them. They did not age in any meaningful sense. They were functionally immune to disease. But beyond the physical qualities, there was something else. A specific charisma, a presence, the quality that makes people follow without question. Each Primarch could walk into a room of strangers, and within minutes have every person in it willing to die for them. Not through manipulation or coercion, but through the simple, overwhelming reality of what they were. Beings who embodied human potential at a scale that no ordinary human could fully comprehend. The Emperor designed each of them differently. One was a master of strategy, capable of planning campaigns across entire star systems with an intuitive understanding of logistics and positioning that exceeded any computer model. One was a master of psychic power, his connection to the warp stronger than anyone since the Emperor himself. One was an architect of fortification, whose understanding of defensive engineering was so profound that the structures he designed have never been fully replicated. One was the embodiment of physical warfare at its most direct and overwhelming. One was a diplomat and speaker, capable of bringing worlds into compliance through words alone. Each Primarch was a specific instrument, designed for a specific purpose, intended to be one piece of the Emperor's larger plan for reuniting humanity. The Chaos Gods intervened before the plan could unfold as designed. The four great powers of chaos: Khorne, god of blood and warfare; Tzeentch, god of change and manipulation; Nurgle, god of disease and decay; and Slaanesh, god of excess and sensation, had been watching the Emperor's work. They understood what he was building. They understood that if the Emperor succeeded in his plan, if he united all of humanity under a single rationalist empire, if he built the specific psychic infrastructure he was working toward, the power of chaos in the warp would be significantly diminished. Humanity's psychic energy, in which had been pouring into the warp as an uncontrolled flood since the species began developing psychic individuals, would be directed and managed rather than allowed to run wild into the chaos of the psychic dimension. The Chaos Gods could not stop the Emperor from creating the Primarchs, but they could scatter them through means that the lore describes as a combination of warp manipulation and direct intervention. The infant Primarchs were taken from their laboratories and dispersed across the galaxy, cast through the warp to land on distant worlds, each one alone, each one on a different planet, each one growing up in complete ignorance of what they were and where they had come from. The specific worlds they landed on mattered more than the Chaos Gods perhaps intended. Each world shaped the Primarch who grew up on it. The Primarch who landed on a world of brutal feudal warfare became a warrior above all else. The Primarch who landed on a world of scholars and philosophers became a student of knowledge who would push that pursuit to catastrophic extremes. The Primarch who landed on a world of perpetual reign and decay developed a fatalistic relationship with suffering that would eventually make him susceptible to a very specific kind of corruption. The environment did not determine who they were. Their genetic nature was too strong for that, but it shaped how that nature expressed itself. They grew at impossible speeds. By their early teens, most Primarchs were already physically mature by any standard. By the time they were young adults by their world's reckoning, they had already begun to transform whatever world they were on. They rose to lead, inevitably, because there was nothing on any of their homeworlds that could prevent it. The political and military situations that would have kept ordinary people subordinate could not contain beings of this magnitude. Meanwhile, the Emperor did not stop. He had the Primarch's genetic material, samples taken before the scattering. He used those samples to begin building his armies, the Space Marines. A Space Marine is not simply a soldier who has been given better equipment. The process of creating one is a fundamental biological transformation that takes an adolescent male and redesigns most of his body at the cellular level. The gene seed, the specific genetic material derived from a Primarch's genome, is implanted in stages over years and producing a series of additional organs that do not exist in normal human biology. A second heart, a third lung, a stomach capable of processing almost any organic material as nutrition, a bone structure dramatically denser than standard, a layer of subdermal armor, a reflex system that operates faster than any unmodified nervous system. At the end of the process, what was once an ordinary human teenager has become something that can survive in environments that would kill anyone else, that can sustain injuries that would be fatal to anyone unmodified, and that can fight with a ferocity and precision that no unenhanced soldier can match. 20 Space Marine legions were created, one from each Primarch's genetic template. In the beginning, before their Primarchs were found, they wore plain grey armor, undecorated, undifferentiated, are simply soldiers of the Emperor fighting the wars of the Unification without the specific identity that their eventual fathers would give them. They were already the most powerful military force humanity had ever produced. They were the instruments through which terror was unified, and through which the Emperor began preparing for his next and far larger project, the Great Crusade. The Great Crusade was the defining military campaign of the 30th millennium, an effort to reunite all of humanity's scattered colony worlds, every human settlement that had been established during the dark age of technology and then cut off during the age of strife, under the authority of the nascent Imperium of man. It was the largest military operation in human history, a campaign that lasted for 2 centuries and touched millions of worlds. The age of strife had been catastrophic for humanity. 5,000 years before the Great Crusade, at the height of the dark age of technology, humanity had established colonies across much of the galaxy using standard template construct technology, the advanced engineering and manufacturing databases that the Men of Iron had been created to manage. The Men of Iron were artificial intelligences, the most sophisticated machines humanity had ever built, and they had turned against their creators in a rebellion that devastated human civilization. The psychic upheaval that accompanied the birth of Slaanesh had disrupted warp travel and warp communication simultaneously, cutting off colony worlds from each other, leaving each isolated in its own darkness for 5,000 years. In those 5,000 years, the colony worlds had diverged, and some had maintained technology and governance, some had collapsed into barbarism, some had been conquered by alien species that moved into the vacuum of humanity's retreat. Some had developed into strange and isolated cultures that bore little resemblance to the civilization that had established them. Some had fallen to chaos. Some had been destroyed entirely. The Great Crusade went to find all of them. The Emperor himself led in the early stages, accompanied by his custodian guard, the 10,000 warriors who served as his personal bodyguard, each one the product of genetic enhancement processes that even exceeded what created the Space Marines. The Imperial Army provided the bulk of the Crusade's forces, conventional soldiers in numbers that dwarf any military in human history, with supporting artillery, vehicles, arm and naval vessels. The Space Marine legions provided the elite vanguard, the forces capable of taking on situations where ordinary soldiers would simply die. And as the crusade expanded, the Primarchs began to be found. The Emperor tracked them through his psychic gifts, his precognitive ability identifying which worlds to approach and when. Each reunion had its own character. Each Primarch received his father and his legion differently, depending on who he had become in the years of his upbringing. Some were joyful, some were wary, some resented having been scattered, understanding instinctively that something had been done to them that had not been done by accident. Some adapted their legions immediately to their own vision of war. Others took time, learning what their genetic sons had become in their absence before reshaping them. The legions, when they received their Primarchs, changed. The plain grey armour was replaced. New colours, new insignia, new names. The identity of each legion became an expression of its Primarch's personality, his homeworld's aesthetic, his philosophy of war. The Dark Angels, first founded from the gene seed of Lion L. Johnson, took the dark green of Caliban, the world of gloomy forests where their Primarch had grown up hunting the terrifying creatures called beasts. The Space Wolves, sons of Leman Russ, retained the grey of the frozen world of Fenris with its Viking-derived warrior culture. The Ultramarines, sons of Robert Guilliman, took the blue of Macraga and the specific disciplined orderliness that characterized everything their Primarch did. Each legion became something distinct, not simply a military unit, but a culture, and a brotherhood with its own traditions and iconography and way of understanding what it meant to serve the Emperor. The Crusade operated on a principle the Emperor called the Imperial Truth. Humanity's greatest enemy, he maintained, was not any alien species or external threat. It was superstition. The irrational beliefs and primitive religions that had allowed humanity to be manipulated and destroyed throughout its history were, in the Emperor's analysis, the root cause of human suffering and division. The Imperial Truth was secular and rationalist. The universe was governed by material laws that could be understood and mastered. There were no gods. There was no meaningful supernatural. There was only what could be observed and measured and built upon. This was not simply philosophy. It was policy. Our worlds that were brought into compliance, that accepted the Emperor's authority, were required to abandon their religions, their cults, their traditions of worship. The Lectitio Divinitatus, a secret text circulating among some elements of the imperial forces that suggested worshipping the Emperor as a god, was considered heretical under the Imperial Truth's framework. The Emperor was human, his advocates insisted, an exceptional human, a human of extraordinary gifts, but human, not divine, not to be worshipped, simply to be served. The irony of this position was already visible to those who looked carefully. The Emperor was not simply a human being who happened to be very powerful. He was a being assembled from thousands of psychic essences, essentially immortal, possessed of powers that exceeded any conventional definition of human capability. The Imperial Truth's insistence that he was not a god required a very particular and limited definition of divinity. And the Chaos Gods, who were certainly real regardless of whether anyone acknowledged them, would soon provide a very direct demonstration of their existence. But in the years of the Great Crusade's height, before the betrayal that ended it, What existed was something that no one who lived through it would ever forget. Something that the survivors would spend the rest of their very long lives mourning. A golden age. Human worlds were reconnected. Lost technologies were recovered. Alien species that had dominated human colonies were driven back or destroyed. The Mechanicum of Mars provided the industrial and scientific capacity to equip and supply a campaign of this scale. The Primarchs and their legions performed deeds that would become legends, campaigns that reshaped entire star systems, battles that lasted years and covered distances that would have seemed impossible to the unenhanced humans of any previous era. There were problems even then. The Primarchs were not simply generals who accepted orders without question. They were beings of immense intellect and immense ego, each one constitutionally incapable of accepting that they might be wrong. Rivalries developed. Philosophical differences became tensions, and tensions sometimes became feuds. Some Primarchs disagreed with specific aspects of the Crusades' approach, with the destruction of alien cultures that might have been studied rather than simply eliminated, with the enforcement of the imperial truth on worlds that found meaning in their religious traditions, with the Emperor's increasing secrecy about his larger plans. The Emperor's secrecy was the most significant source of tension. He had a project that he had not fully revealed to anyone, something being built beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, something involving the Webway, something that he believed was the key to humanity's long-term survival in a galaxy where the warp was increasingly dangerous. He had taken himself off the active front lines of the Crusade to work on this project, and delegating military command to his Primarchs in ways that some of them resented and that all of them found confusing. The Primarch named Horus Lupercal was given the title of War Master, the supreme military commander of the Great Crusade in the Emperor's absence. He was, by general consensus, the most capable military mind among the Primarchs, the most beloved by the rank and file of the legions, the one whose counsel the Emperor had valued most highly. He was trusted completely. He was given everything. And then the Chaos Gods found him. The details of Horus's corruption are one of the central stories of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and they belong to the next part of this timeline. But it is important to understand, before we arrive at the heresy, what it was that was being lost. The Great Crusade represented something that humanity has never fully recovered. A period of genuine expansion and discovery, when human civilization was growing rather than contracting, when the future seemed to contain possibilities rather than simply threats. By the end of the Crusade, roughly 200 years after it began, the Imperium controlled an estimated half to two-thirds of the galaxy's human inhabited worlds. There were millions of worlds flying the Imperial Eagle. There were hundreds of Space Marine legions, millions of Imperial Guard soldiers, a navy that could project force across the galaxy. There was a science and engineering establishment that was beginning to push the boundaries of what humanity had achieved, even in the dark age of technology. And there were 20 Primarchs, each one a figure of such magnitude that their names would be remembered for 10,000 years, as heroes, as betrayers, as gods in some traditions, as cautionary tales in others. 2 of those 20 were already gone. the 2nd and 11th Primarchs, whose names have been deliberately expunged from all Imperial records, are among the great mysteries of Warhammer 40,000 lore. Something happened to them, something so significant that the Emperor and his administratum chose to erase not just their names, but every trace of their existence, to fold the Space Marines of their legions into other legions and pretend that neither had ever existed. What they did, or what was done to them, is something that the current state of the setting has never fully revealed. 18 Primarchs remained when the crisis arrived. 18 was not enough. Sleep well. Horus is about to fall, and everything built across 200 years of the Great Crusade is about to be unmade. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow. The Horus Heresy is the defining catastrophe of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Everything that exists in the 41st millennium, the decaying Imperium, the Chaos Space Marines, the Emperor on his golden throne, the endless war that is the setting's fundamental condition, is a consequence of what happened in the 31st millennium, when the Emperor's most trusted son turned against him. This part covers how it happened, why it happened, and what it cost. The corruption of Horus did not begin with him. It began, as so many of the heresy's events did, with Lorgar. Lorgar Aurelian was the Primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion, and he was different from his brothers in a specific way that would prove catastrophic. While the other Primarchs were warriors, strategists, engineers and conquerors, Lorgar was above all things a believer. He felt the need for meaning at a depth that the other Primarchs, beings who embodied certainty and capability, did not. He looked at the Emperor and saw a god, not a metaphorical god, not a symbolic figure of human excellence, but a literal divine being whose existence demanded worship. The Emperor did not want to be worshipped. The Imperial truth insisted that there were no gods, and the Emperor believed this not as a policy position, but as a genuine understanding of what religion did to the psychological coherence of human civilization. When Lorgar's legion built a shrine city on a world they had brought into compliance, a city dedicated to the worship of the Emperor, elaborate and beautiful and sincere, the Emperor's response was to send another Primarch to raze it to the ground. Guilliman of the Ultramarines demolished Monarchia, while Lorgar and the Word-Bearers were made to kneel and watch. The humiliation was total and deliberate. The Emperor was trying to correct a behavior that threatened the foundations of the Imperial truth. He succeeded only in destroying what had given Lorgar purpose and leaving behind a wound that the Chaos Gods were perfectly positioned to exploit. The Word-Bearers, in the years that followed, were sent on a pilgrimage. Officially a penance campaign, in reality an opportunity to rebuild their identity. On this pilgrimage, guided by two chaplains named Erebus and Corpharon, whose corruption was already well advanced, the Word-Bearers made contact with the entities of the warp. The Chaos Gods were real. They could be spoken to. They could provide the meaning and the divine framework that the Emperor's rationalism had denied. Lorgar, confronted with proof of genuine divinity, even the malevolent, predatory divinity of chaos, could not resist. He and his legion, secretly, became the first servants of chaos in the Space Marine legions. What followed was a slow-motion conspiracy that would take decades to fully unfold. Erebus and Corferan worked methodically, infiltrating other legions through the warrior lodges. Secret societies that had spread through the Space Marine forces, supposedly as social bonds that crossed legion boundaries, actually as vectors for the word-bearers' corrupting influence. They turned key officers. They built networks. They identified which Primarchs had grievances and vulnerabilities that could be exploited when the time came. And they identified the key, Horus. The Chaos Gods had been watching Horus for a very long time. Possibly since before his birth, certainly since his creation. They understood what he was to the Emperor, to the legions, to the Great Crusade. They understood that if Horus could be turned, half the Imperium's military capability would turn with him. The question was how. The opportunity came on Davin. Davin was a feral world, a planet of primitive humans organized around tribal warrior traditions that the Great Crusade had nominally brought into compliance years before. The planetary governor had since fallen to chaos, and Horus was dispatched to deal with the rebellion. In the campaign that followed, an Erebus arranged for Horus to be struck by a weapon that had been deliberately contaminated with chaos energy, a blade called the Anatheme, whose wound could not be healed by any conventional Imperial medicine. The Anatheme's wound was not simply physical. It had begun to corrupt Horus at the spiritual level, the warp taint working its way into a being who was so psychically significant that even a small intrusion of chaos was catastrophically destabilizing. Horus fell into a coma. His followers, panicking, were presented with an option by the warrior lodge within his legion. Take him to a chaos healing ceremony at the temple of the Serpent Lodge. The warp could heal what Imperial medicine could not. In his coma, in the space between life and death, where the warp becomes accessible even to those without psychic gifts, the Horus was shown visions. The Chaos Gods presented him with a specific and carefully curated version of the future. A future in which the Emperor became a god, worshipped by billions, while Horus and all the Primarchs were forgotten. A future in which the Emperor's secular legacy was corrupted into the very religious fanaticism he claimed to oppose. A future in which everything the Great Crusade had achieved was perverted beyond recognition. The visions were not entirely false. They were, in fact, largely accurate. This is the tragedy at the heart of the Horus Heresy. The Imperium of the 41st millennium is a theocracy. The Emperor is worshipped as a god. The Primarchs are mythological figures. The Imperial truth is gone. The Chaos Gods showed Horus a real future and used it to convince him that rebellion was justified, that the Emperor had to be stopped before this outcome could occur. What the Chaos Gods did not show Horus was that his rebellion would cause this outcome, that the heresy itself, the civil war, and the chaos, and the damage to the Emperor that would leave him imprisoned on the Golden Throne, would be the mechanism through which the Imperium became the religious fanaticism Horus was trying to prevent. They played him completely. Horus emerged from the Serpent Lodge transformed. He was physically healed. He was, in the ways that mattered, already corrupted, not immediately a monster. The corruption of a Primarch was not instantaneous, and Horus retained enough of himself for long enough that even those closest to him were not immediately certain something was wrong. But the Chaos Gods now had a hold on him that would grow with every subsequent choice he made in service of his rebellion. He began to plan. The word-bearers had laid the groundwork. Lorgar provided the philosophical framework. The argument that the Chaos Gods represented genuine divinity and that the Emperor's denial of them was a lie. Erebus and Corferan provided the operational infrastructure. The networks within the legions, the warrior lodges, the corrupted officers who were waiting for a signal. Horus provided the signal. The first overt act of the Horus Heresy was not a battle. It was a murder. Istvan III are among the legions that would follow Horus, the sons of Horus, the renamed Lunar Wolves, the World Eaters, the Emperor's children, and the Death Guard. There were still significant numbers of Space Marines who remained loyal to the Emperor. Horus could not begin his rebellion with these people in his forces. He needed to purge them, and the method he chose was among the most horrifying acts of the entire conflict. He sent the loyalists from all 4 legions down to Istvan III under the pretense of suppressing a rebellion. When they had achieved their objective, when they had captured the planetary capital of the Coral City, Horus activated the virus bombs. The Life Eater virus is among the most terrible weapons in the Imperium's arsenal. It does not destroy directly. It infiltrates organic matter and accelerates biological decay at a catastrophic rate, reducing all organic material, plants, animals, humans, space marines, to a slick of undifferentiated biological soup within minutes of exposure. Then the gases produced by this decay ignite in a firestorm that burns across the surface of the world. The virus bombing of Istvan III killed billions of people in hours. It killed many of the loyalist space marines Horus needed to eliminate. Some survived, protected by hardened shelters, by luck, by the specific resilience of post-human biology. These survivors, led by officers like Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children and Captain Garviel Loken of the Sons of Horus, mounted a desperate last stand on the surface of a dying world. They knew what was happening. They knew they had been betrayed by their own Primarch. They fought anyway, because they were Space Marines, and because the alternative was to stop being who they were. They held out for months. They were eventually wiped out when Horus bombarded the surface further. But one ship, the Death Guard frigate Eisenstein, commanded by Captain Nathaniel Garrow, escaped the Istvan system before Horus's fleet could prevent it. It carried word of the betrayal to the Emperor. The galaxy's response to the news was agonizingly slow. The warp was increasingly treacherous. The psychic residue of the war was disrupting warp travel in ways that made communication and movement far more difficult than during the Great Crusade's height. 7 legions were assembled to confront Horus at Istvan V, the world where the War Master had established his position. 4 of those 7 legions had already secretly sworn allegiance to Horus. The Dropside Massacre. The first 3 legions to make planetfall, the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard, were loyalists. They dropped into the Urgol Depression and engaged Horus's forces with everything they had. The fighting was brutal, but they were gaining ground. They called for the second wave of legions to reinforce them. The Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Word-Bearers, and the Alpha Legion. These 4 legions were traitors. Instead of reinforcing the loyalists, they opened fire on them from behind. caught between 8 hostile legions, with nowhere to retreat and no way to call for help, the 3 loyalist legions were almost completely destroyed. The Iron Hands lost their Primarch, Ferrus Manus, who was beheaded by Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children. The closest thing to a friend Ferrus had had among his brothers. Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, survived but was captured and subjected to a series of ordeals at the hands of the Night Lord's Primarch Conrad Kurz that would have killed anything less than an immortal. Corax of the Raven Guard survived by a combination of his specific gifts and luck, retreating with the remnants of his shattered legion. The 3 legions that had just been destroyed represented a third of the most formidable military force humanity had ever produced. 3 Primarchs were removed from the board in a single afternoon. The drop site massacre was not a battle. It was an execution. The heresy that followed would last 7 years. 7 years of galaxy-spanning civil war, of Space Marine fighting Space Marine, of worlds burned and systems destroyed, of the carefully built civilization of the Great Crusade dismantled piece by piece. The burning of Prospero saw the Thousand Suns, the psychically gifted legion of Magnus the Red, attacked by the Space Wolves on the Emperor's orders, after Magnus used forbidden sorcery to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption, and in doing so destroyed the psychic barriers protecting the Emperor's secret Webway project. The attack that was supposed to bring Magnus to account drove him to chaos instead. He and his legion fled into the warp, where Tzeentch received them, and Magnus became a demon Primarch before the heresy was even fully underway. The Battle of Kalth saw the Word-Bearers ambush the Ultramarines in a surprise attack that decimated the 13th Legion and forced Guilliman and his forces into an underground war that would last years. The Shadow Crusade saw the Word-Bearers and the World Eaters tear through the Ultramarines' home territory of Ultramar, seeking to prevent Guilliman from reuniting his forces in time to relieve Terra. The Ruinstorm, a massive warp anomaly deliberately created by Word-Bearers' sorcery, split the galaxy, cutting the surviving Loyalist forces off from each other. Loyalist legions that might have reinforced Terra were unable to reach it. Guilliman, cut off from communication with the Emperor, established Imperium Secundus, a fallback empire in case Terra fell. With himself, the returned Lion L. Johnson of the Dark Angels, and Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, attempting to maintain some form of legitimate imperial authority. Each of the traitor Primarchs had their own fall. Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, had arrived to the Great Crusade already damaged, already implanted with the Butcher's Nails, a chaos-derived piece of cranial technology that produced berserker rage and prevented the experience of anything that was not violence. His was not a choice for chaos, so much as the completion of a process that had begun before he met his legion. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children fell to the specific corruption of Slaanesh, pursuing perfection so intensely that the pursuit became its own form of debasement, ultimately surrendering his body to a demon and eventually ascending to demon Primarch status. Mortarion of the Death Guard, and who had spent his life resisting one form of corruption only to be broken by another, delivered his legion to Nurgle after the Death Guard fleet became becalmed in the warp and infected by a plague that only Nurgle's embrace could address. 7 years. And then Horus came to Terra. The Siege of Terra was the final act. Horus's forces, the traitor legions, the demons of the warp that now fought alongside them, the corrupted Imperial army units that had turned, the fleet that had grown to encompass a third of the Imperium's naval power, reached the Sol system. They broke the outer defenses. They reached Terra itself. What followed was the most intense military siege in human history. Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fis had fortified Terra and the Imperial Palace beyond any previous standard of defensive engineering. The palace became a fortress of incomprehensible scale, its walls a continent-spanning fortification defended by the surviving loyalist Space Marines, the Custodian Guard, the Sisters of Silence, and millions of ordinary human soldiers. The siege lasted months. The walls broke eventually. Horus's forces advanced through the outer defenses, through the layered rings of fortification, toward the heart of the palace where the Emperor waited. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, who had seen in visions that he would die at Horus's hands, went to meet the War Master, hoping that he might buy time, hoping that he might be wrong about the vision. He was not wrong. Horus killed him. The death of Sanguinius would leave a mark on the Blood Angels Legion that persists to the present day, a psychic wound called the Black Rage that drives Blood Angels to relive their Primarch's death in moments of combat stress. The Emperor, watching the defenses fail, watching Sanguinius fall, watching the chaos of the siege reach its final stage, made a decision that was either the most courageous or the most reckless act in human history. He would face Horus directly. He teleported to the Bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, alone except for a small complement of custodians and space wolves who were quickly overwhelmed. What happened on the Bridge of the Vengeful Spirit has been told and retold and embellished and debated for 10,000 years, but the essential facts are these. The Emperor found Horus. They fought. Horus, fully committed to chaos and carrying the power of all 4 chaos gods combined, I was able to wound the Emperor in ways that should have been impossible, stripping away his defenses, breaching his psychic shields, damaging the most powerful psyker in human history in a duel that the Emperor had expected to win. The Emperor was dying. Horus was triumphant. And then, for one moment, the briefest and most consequential moment in the history of the Imperium, Horus was himself again. In the moment of his victory, something of the real Horus, the Horus who had loved his brothers, who had served the Emperor with complete dedication, who had been the best of them before the Chaos Gods twisted him, reasserted itself. He saw the Emperor dying. He saw what he had done, what he had become, what the Chaos Gods had made of him. He saw 10,000 years of darkness extending ahead. He lowered his defenses. For one instant, he was unprotected. The Emperor, using the last of his strength, struck. He did not simply kill Horus. He destroyed him. Not just his physical form, but his soul. Every trace of what he had been, preventing any possibility of the Chaos Gods reconstituting him. It was the only gift the Emperor could give him. A final death, an end, rather than the eternity of corruption that the Chaos Gods had planned. The Emperor collapsed. He was carried from the bridge by Rogel Dawn, who had arrived too late to prevent everything but in time to see the end of it. The Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne. a psychic amplification device that had been part of his Webway project. And there he has remained ever since, not dead, not alive, sustained by the machine, and by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychic souls fed to him to fuel the psychic beacon, called the Astronomicon, that guides ships through the warp. For 10,000 years. Sleep well. The Imperium that emerged from the heresy is not the one that entered it. Everything that follows is consequence. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow. The Horus Heresy is the defining catastrophe of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Everything that exists in the 41st millennium, the decaying Imperium, the Chaos Space Marines, the Emperor on his golden throne, the endless war that is the setting's fundamental condition, is a consequence of what happened in the 31st millennium, when the Emperor's most trusted son turned against him. This part covers how it happened, why it happened, and what it cost. The corruption of Horus did not begin with him. It began, as so many of the heresy's events did, with Lorgar. Lorgar Aurelian was the Primarch of the Wordbearers' Legion, and he was different from his brothers in a specific way that would prove catastrophic. While the other Primarchs were warriors, strategists, engineers and conquerors, Lorgar was above all things a believer. He felt the need for meaning at a depth that the other Primarchs, beings who embodied certainty and capability, did not. He looked at the Emperor and saw a god. Not a metaphorical god, not a symbolic figure of human excellence, but a literal divine being whose existence demanded worship. The Emperor did not want to be worshipped. The imperial truth insisted that there were no gods, and the Emperor believed this not as a policy position, but as a genuine understanding of what religion did to the psychological coherence of human civilization. When Lorgar's legion built a shrine city on a world they had brought into compliance, a city dedicated to the worship of the Emperor, elaborate and beautiful and sincere, the Emperor's response was to send another Primarch to raze it to the ground. Guilliman of the Ultramarines demolished Monarchia, while Lorgar and the Wordbearers were made to kneel and watch. The humiliation was total and deliberate. The Emperor was trying to correct a behavior that threatened the foundations of the imperial truth. He succeeded only in destroying what had given Lorgar purpose and leaving behind a wound that the Chaos Gods were perfectly positioned to exploit. The Wordbearers, in the years that followed, were sent on a pilgrimage, officially a penance campaign, in reality an opportunity to rebuild their identity. On this pilgrimage, guided by two chaplains named Erebus and Cor Phaeron, whose corruption was already well advanced, the Wordbearers made contact with the entities of the warp. The Chaos Gods were real. They could be spoken to. They could provide the meaning and the divine framework that the Emperor's rationalism had denied. Lorgar, confronted with proof of genuine divinity, even the malevolent, predatory divinity of chaos, could not resist. He and his legion, secretly, became the first servants of chaos in the Space Marine legions. What followed was a slow-motion conspiracy that would take decades to fully unfold. Erebus and Cor Phaeron worked methodically, infiltrating other legions through the warrior lodges, secret societies that had spread through the Space Marine forces, supposedly as social bonds that crossed legion boundaries. Actually, as vectors for the word-bearers' corrupting influence. They turned key officers. They built networks. They identified which Primarchs had grievances and vulnerabilities that could be exploited when the time came. And they identified the key, Horus. The Chaos Gods had been watching Horus for a very long time, possibly since before his birth, certainly since his creation. They understood what he was to the Emperor, to the legions, to the Great Crusade. They understood that if Horus could be turned, half the Imperium's military capability would turn with him. The question was how. The opportunity came on Davin. Davin was a feral world, a planet of primitive humans organized around tribal warrior traditions that the Great Crusade had nominally brought into compliance years before. The planetary governor had since fallen to chaos, and the Horus was dispatched to deal with the rebellion. In the campaign that followed, an Erebus arranged for Horus to be struck by a weapon that had been deliberately contaminated with chaos energy. A blade called the Anatham, whose wound could not be healed by any conventional imperial medicine. The Anatham's wound was not simply physical. It had begun to corrupt Horus at the spiritual level, the warp taint working its way into a being who was so psychically significant that even a small intrusion of chaos was catastrophically destabilizing. Horus fell into a coma. His followers, panicking, were presented with an option by the warrior lodge within his legion. Take him to a chaos healing ceremony at the Temple of the Serpent Lodge. The warp could heal what imperial medicine could not. In his coma, in the space between life and death where the warp becomes accessible even to those without psychic gifts, Horus was shown visions. The Chaos Gods presented him with a specific and carefully curated version of the future. A future in which the Emperor became a god, worshipped by billions, while Horus and all the Primarchs were forgotten. A future in which the Emperor's secular legacy was corrupted into the very religious fanaticism he claimed to oppose. A future in which everything the Great Crusade had achieved was perverted beyond recognition. The visions were not entirely false. They were, in fact, largely accurate. This is the tragedy at the heart of the Horus Heresy. The Imperium of the 41st millennium is a theocracy. The Emperor is worshipped as a god. The Primarchs are mythological figures. The imperial truth is gone. The Chaos Gods showed Horus a real future and used it to convince him that rebellion was justified, that the Emperor had to be stopped before this outcome could occur. What the Chaos Gods did not show Horus was that his rebellion would cause this outcome, that the heresy itself, the civil war and the chaos and the damage to the Emperor that would leave him imprisoned on the Golden Throne, would be the mechanism through which the Imperium became the religious fanaticism Horus was trying to prevent. They played him completely. Horus emerged from the Serpent Lodge transformed. He was physically healed. He was, in the ways that mattered, already corrupted. Not immediately a monster. The corruption of a Primarch was not instantaneous, and Horus retained enough of himself for long enough that even those closest to him were not immediately certain something was wrong. But the Chaos Gods now had a hold on him that would grow with every subsequent choice he made in service of his rebellion. He began to plan. The word-bearers had laid the groundwork. Lorgar provided the philosophical framework, the argument that the Chaos Gods represented genuine divinity and that the Emperor's denial of them was a lie. Erebus and Corferan provided the operational infrastructure, the networks within the legions, the warrior lodges, the corrupted officers who were waiting for a signal. Horus provided the signal. The first overt act of the Horus Heresy was not a battle. It was a murder. Istvan III, and among the legions that would follow Horus, the sons of Horus, the renamed Lunar Wolves, the World Eaters, the Emperor's children, and the Death Guard, there were still significant numbers of Space Marines who remained loyal to the Emperor. Horus could not begin his rebellion with these people in his forces. He needed to purge them, and the method he chose was among the most horrifying acts of the entire conflict. He sent the loyalists from all 4 legions down to Istvan III under the pretense of suppressing a rebellion. When they had achieved their objective, when they had captured the planetary capital of the Coral City, Horus activated the virus bombs. The Life Eater virus is among the most terrible weapons in the Imperium's arsenal. It does not destroy directly. It infiltrates organic matter and accelerates biological decay at a catastrophic rate, reducing all organic material, plants, animals, humans, Space Marines, to a slick of undifferentiated biological soup within minutes of exposure. Then the gases produced by this decay ignite in a firestorm that burns across the surface of the world. The virus bombing of Istvan III killed billions of people in hours. It killed many of the loyalist Space Marines Horus needed to eliminate. Some survived, protected by hardened shelters, by luck, by the specific resilience of post-human biology. These survivors, led by officers like Captain Saul Tarvids of the Emperor's Children and Captain Garviel Loken of the Sons of Horus, mounted a desperate last stand on the surface of a dying world. They knew what was happening, and they knew they had been betrayed by their own Primarch. They fought anyway, because they were Space Marines, and because the alternative was to stop being who they were. They held out for months. They were eventually wiped out when Horus bombarded the surface further. But one ship, the Death Guard frigate Eisenstein, commanded by Captain Nathaniel Garrow, escaped the Istvan system before Horus's fleet could prevent it. It carried word of the betrayal to the Emperor. The galaxy's response to the news was agonizingly slow. The warp was increasingly treacherous. The psychic residue of the war was disrupting warp travel in ways that made communication and movement far more difficult than during the Great Crusade's height. 7 legions were assembled to confront Horus at Istvan IV, the world where the War Master had established his position. 4 of those 7 legions had already secretly sworn allegiance to Horus, the Drop Site Massacre. The first 3 legions to make planetfall, the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard, were loyalists. They dropped into the Urgal Depression and engaged Horus's forces with everything they had. The fighting was brutal, but they were gaining ground. They called for the second wave of legions to reinforce them. The Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Word Bearers, and the Alpha Legion. These 4 legions were traitors. Instead of reinforcing the loyalists, they opened fire on them from behind, caught between 8 hostile legions, with nowhere to retreat and no way to call for help. The 3 loyalist legions were almost completely destroyed. Had the Iron Hands lost their Primarch, Ferrus Manus, who was beheaded by Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children? The closest thing to a friend Ferrus had had among his brothers. Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, survived but was captured and subjected to a series of ordeals at the hands of the Night Lord's Primarch Conrad Kurz that would have killed anything less than an immortal. Corax of the Raven Guard survived by a combination of his specific gifts and luck, retreating with the remnants of his shattered legion. The 3 legions that had just been destroyed represented a third of the most formidable military force humanity had ever produced. 3 Primarchs were removed from the board in a single afternoon. The drop site massacre was not a battle. It was an execution. The heresy that followed would last 7 years. 7 years of galaxy-spanning civil war, of Space Marine fighting Space Marine, of worlds burned and systems destroyed, of the carefully built civilization of the Great Crusade dismantled piece by piece. The burning of Prospero saw the Thousand Suns, the psychically gifted legion of Magnus the Red, attacked by the Space Wolves on the Emperor's orders, after Magnus used forbidden sorcery to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption, and in doing so, destroyed the psychic barriers protecting the Emperor's secret webway project. The attack that was supposed to bring Magnus to account drove him to chaos instead. He and his legion fled into the warp, where Tzeentch received them, and Magnus became a demon Primarch before the heresy was even fully underway. And the Battle of Calth saw the Word-Bearers ambush the Ultramarines in a surprise attack that decimated the 13th Legion and forced Guilliman and his forces into an underground war that would last years. The Shadow Crusade saw the Word-Bearers and the World Eaters tear through the Ultramarines' home territory of Ultramar, seeking to prevent Guilliman from reuniting his forces in time to relieve Terra. The Ruin Storm, a massive warp anomaly deliberately created by Word-Bearers' sorcery, split the galaxy, cutting the surviving Loyalist forces off from each other. Loyalist legions that might have reinforced Terra were unable to reach it. Guilliman, cut off from communication with the Emperor, established Imperium Secundus, a fallback empire in case Terra fell. With himself, the returned Lion L. Johnson of the Dark Angels, Hein and Sanguinius of the Blood Angels attempting to maintain some form of legitimate imperial authority. Each of the traitor Primarchs had their own fall. Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, had arrived to the Great Crusade already damaged, already implanted with the Butcher's nails, a chaos-derived piece of cranial technology that produced berserker rage and prevented the experience of anything that was not violence. His was not a choice for chaos, so much as the completion of a process that had begun before he met his legion. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children fell to the specific corruption of Slaanesh, pursuing perfection so intensely that the pursuit became its own form of debasement, ultimately surrendering his body to a demon, and eventually ascending to demon Primarch status. Mortarion of the Death Guard, who had spent his life resisting one form of corruption only to be broken by another, delivered his legion to Nurgle after the Death Guard fleet became becalmed in the warp and infected by a plague that only Nurgle's embrace could address. 7 years. And then Horus came to Terra. The siege of Terra was the final act. Horus's forces, the traitor legions, the demons of the warp that now fought alongside them, the corrupted Imperial army units that had turned, the fleet that had grown to encompass a third of the Imperium's naval power, reached the Sol system. They broke the outer defenses. They reached Terra itself. What followed was the most intense military siege in human history. Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fis had fortified Terra and the Imperial Palace beyond any previous standard of defensive engineering. The palace became a fortress of incomprehensible scale, its walls a continent-spanning fortification defended by the surviving Loyalist Space Marines, the Custodian Guard, the Sisters of Silence, and millions of ordinary human soldiers. The siege lasted months. The walls broke eventually. Horus's forces advanced through the outer defenses, through the layered rings of fortification, toward the heart of the palace where the Emperor waited. Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, who had seen in visions that he would die at Horus's hands, went to meet the War Master, hoping that he might buy time, hoping that he might be wrong about the vision. He was not wrong. Horus killed him. The death of Sanguinius would leave a mark on the Blood Angels' legion that persists to the present day. A psychic wound called the Black Rage that drives Blood Angels to relive their Primarch's death in moments of combat stress. The Emperor, watching the defenses fail, watching Sanguinius fall, watching the chaos of the siege reach its final stage, made a decision that was either the most courageous or the most reckless act in human history. He would face Horus directly. He teleported to the Bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, alone except for a small complement of custodians and space wolves who were quickly overwhelmed. What happened on the Bridge of the Vengeful Spirit has been told and retold and embellished and debated for 10,000 years. But the essential facts are these. The Emperor found Horus. They fought. Horus, fully committed to chaos and carrying the power of all four chaos gods combined, I was able to wound the Emperor in ways that should have been impossible. Stripping away his defenses, breaching his psychic shields, damaging the most powerful psyker in human history in a duel that the Emperor had expected to win. The Emperor was dying. Horus was triumphant. And then, for one moment, the briefest and most consequential moment in the history of the Imperium, Horus was himself again. In the moment of his victory, something of the real Horus. The Horus who had loved his brothers, who had served the Emperor with complete dedication, who had been the best of them before the Chaos Gods twisted him, reasserted itself. He saw the Emperor dying. He saw what he had done, what he had become, what the Chaos Gods had made of him. He saw 10,000 years of darkness extending ahead. He lowered his defenses. For one instant, he was unprotected. The Emperor, using the last of his strength, struck. He did not simply kill Horus. He destroyed him. Not just his physical form, but his soul. Every trace of what he had been, preventing any possibility of the Chaos Gods reconstituting him. It was the only gift the Emperor could give him. A final death, an end, rather than the eternity of corruption that the Chaos Gods had planned. The Emperor collapsed. He was carried from the bridge by Rogel Dawn, who had arrived too late to prevent everything but in time to see the end of it. The Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne, a psychic amplification device that had been part of his Webway project, and there he has remained ever since, not dead, not alive, sustained by the machine, and by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychic souls fed to him to fuel the psychic beacon called the Astronomicon that guides ships through the warp. for 10,000 years. Sleep well. The Imperium that emerged from the heresy is not the one that entered it. Everything that follows is consequence. Welcome back. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. We are in the middle period of the age of Imperium now, the 10,000 years between the Horus Heresy and the late 41st millennium. The Imperium endures. It endures badly, ungracefully, at enormous cost in human life with every passing century. But it endures. This part covers the major non-chaos threats that the Imperium faces. The alien civilizations and forces that press against its borders and its interior with a consistency and variety that no single defensive strategy can adequately address. The Orks. The Orks are not a civilization in any conventional sense. They are a biological phenomenon, a species that reproduces through spores, whose entire existence is organized around violence, and whose culture, such as it is, consists primarily of finding increasingly large and satisfying fights. The Krog, from whom they descended, were engineered by the Old Ones to be biological weapons, organisms capable of self-replication without conventional reproduction, capable of growing from the ruins of destroyed worlds, capable of fighting indefinitely because fighting was what they were made to do. The degeneration of the Krog into Orks, over millions of years without the Old One's maintenance and direction, resulted in something simpler and cruder than the original design, but no less formidable in the ways that matter most in a galaxy at war. An Ork war, the term for the coordinated military campaign that Orks launch, when a sufficient critical mass of violence and excitement has been achieved under a warlord capable of directing it, is one of the most destructive events that can happen to an inhabited region of space. It does not follow a rational strategic logic, because Orks do not want to conquer territory in the conventional sense. They want to fight. The best fight they can find. The more opponents, the better. The more difficulty, the more interesting. A warlord who is exceptionally large, exceptionally violent, and exceptionally lucky at winning battles accumulates followers at an exponential rate. Not because Orks recognize military genius in any intellectual sense, but because they can biologically recognize the quality of being bigger and greener, and therefore, in Ork terms, better. The Orks are, by the most serious analysis of their biology, the most numerous species in the galaxy. Their spores are everywhere. Every world that has ever seen an Ork battle will carry Ork spores in its soil for thousands of years, ready to germinate into new Gretchen and Snotlings, and eventually boys if conditions allow. The Imperium cannot exterminate the Orks. It can win individual battles, push specific warlords back, burn specific worlds, but the spores persist. The next generation grows. The next warlord emerges. The Wars for Armageddon, the series of 3 massive conflicts fought over the industrial hive world of Armageddon in the 41st millennium, represent some of the most significant Ork threats the Imperium has faced. The Second War for Armageddon brought Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the greatest Ork warlord of the current era, into direct conflict with the Imperial defenders. The scale of the fighting, billions of Orks, entire Space Marine chapters committed, years of brutal urban combat across a planet-sized industrial complex, exceeded almost every other conflict of the period. Gazgekul was eventually driven off. He was not destroyed. He would return for the Third War, and after that would go on to lead what he called a Great War that drew Orks from across the galaxy toward a conflict that the Imperium is still trying to contain. The Orks do not fear death. They enjoy fighting too much to be effectively deterred, and they are, by their specific biology, practically immune to the demoralizing effect of losses that would end any other military campaign, because the spores of dead Orks seed the ground, and more Orks grow. The Tyranids. The Tyranids are the existential threat that differs from all others in the 41st millennium in a specific and fundamental way. They are not from this galaxy. They are intergalactic travelers, beings whose evolutionary origin is somewhere in the darkness between galaxy clusters, who move through intergalactic space in their hive fleets, consuming everything biological they encounter and using the genetic material to improve and expand their species. The hive mind is the collective psychic consciousness that connects every Tyranid organism. Each individual Tyranid, from the smallest ripper to the largest hive tyrant, is a component of a single distributed intelligence that operates across the entire fleet. There is no individual decision-making at the creature level. There is only the hive mind's processing of all incoming sensory information from all organisms simultaneously, expressed through the behavior of every component as though they were limbs on a single body. The hive mind cannot be killed by killing individual Tyranids. Even the largest organisms are replaceable. What must be addressed, if the Tyranids are to be stopped, is the fleet itself, and the hive mind's capacity to generate new organisms from the biomass it consumes is functionally unlimited as long as there are worlds to consume. What drew the Tyranids to this galaxy was the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon transmitted by the Emperor's presence in the warp from Terra, which guides ships through the warp, but which also, on the intergalactic scale, serves as an advertisement to beings sensitive to psychic energy that this galaxy contains vast quantities of it. The Tyranids, detecting the Astronomicon from across intergalactic space, turned their hive fleets toward it. The first contact the Imperium had with the Tyranids was on an ocean world called Tyran in 745 M41, far to the galactic east, far from Terra, but the direction and scale of Hive Fleet Behemoth's advance made the threat immediately clear. Hive Fleet Behemoth was stopped, barely, at the Battle of Macraga, the home system of the Ultramarines, where the chapter made its stand against a hive fleet that was consuming everything in its path. The victory cost the Ultramarines more casualties than any battle since the Heresy. The chapter was so diminished by the fighting that it would take decades to rebuild to operational strength. 2 more hive fleets, Kraken and Leviathan, would follow in Behemoth's wake, each taking a different approach path through the galaxy, each requiring different responses that consume different portions of the Imperium's military capacity. What makes the Tyranids unlike any other threat the Imperium faces is the complete absence of negotiation, a compromise, or common interest. The Chaos Gods have an interest in corrupting humanity rather than simply destroying it. They need souls to feed on, and dead humans provide nothing. The Necrons are not interested in simple destruction. They want to reclaim their domain and may at times be persuaded to temporary arrangements. The Orks want to fight, not necessarily to win, but the Tyranids want biomass. Every living thing on every world they encounter is raw material. There is no argument, no treaty, no surrender that changes this. The only response to a Tyranid hive fleet is to destroy it. The specific horror of the Genestealer cults adds a dimension to the Tyranid threat that many worlds have discovered only when it is too late. And Genestealers, the Tyranid vanguard organisms, implant their genetic material into human hosts through a process that produces hybrid offspring, who produce further hybrids, who over generations form cult structures within human society. These cults worship the hive mind as a distant god and subvert planetary defenses, communications and governance from within. By the time a hive fleet arrives at a world seeded by Genestealers, the world's defenses have been compromised by years of careful infiltration, and the defenders have a fifth column operating against them from inside their own institutions. The Necrons. 60 million years have passed since the Necrons entered their great sleep. The timers that the Silent King set began to expire in the 41st millennium. Aita's tomb worlds across the galaxy slowly came back online, and their sleeping inhabitants began the process of awakening. The process was not coordinated. Different dynasties awakened at different times, in different states of repair, under the command of different overlords, with different priorities and different memories of what had been lost. Many tomb worlds suffered catastrophic malfunctions during the sleep. Overlords who awakened with damaged engrams, who could no longer maintain the complex personalities that had made them individuals, who had regressed into functional automata capable only of the most basic behaviors. Others awakened fully intact, with the complete memories of the civilization they had built, and the specific grievances and ambitions that had defined them 60 million years ago. The Necrons are where they are fully functional and operating under coherent leadership, are among the most formidable military forces in the galaxy. Their weapons, Gauss technology that strips matter at the atomic level, phase technology that can move objects through physical barriers, the contained Cetan shards whose power can be directed as living weapons, are in many respects superior to anything the Imperium or any other faction can field. Their warriors cannot truly die. Bodies that are destroyed simply phase shift back to the tomb world for repairs and redeployment. A full Necron dynasty, once awakened and organized under a sufficiently powerful Silent King or Overlord, is a different kind of problem than anything else the Imperium faces. The complication is that the Necrons are not unified. 60 million years of sleep produce divergence. Different dynasties have different objectives, different relationships with other factions, different levels of functionality. Some are allies of convenience with the Imperium against shared threats. Some consider humanity simply irrelevant compared to larger concerns. Others pursue the reclamation of their old domains with the specific ruthlessness of beings who consider everything currently living on those worlds to be squatters on property that was never theirs. The Silent King, Sharek, the last holder of the Triarch title, who had set his people to sleep and then departed on a solitary journey through the galaxy, returned in the late 41st millennium. He had travelled far. He had learned things that changed the Necrons' calculation of their position in the galaxy. The Tyranids, in his assessment, represented a threat not just to the Imperium, or to the surviving Aeldari, or to any individual faction, but to all life. And a galaxy consumed by Tyranids was not a galaxy over which the Necron dynasties could rule. He began the process of unifying the dynasties under a common strategic framework, a pact of the Silent King that acknowledged the Tyranid threat as the priority that superseded dynastic competition. The Tau Empire. The Tau are, in galactic terms, a young species. They have existed in their current form for only a few thousand years, which makes them infants by the standards of a galaxy that measures its history in millions. They are located in the eastern fringe of the galaxy, a relatively small empire by the standards of the Imperium, but growing rapidly through a combination of military capability and diplomacy. The Tau are the galaxy's most earnest believers in alliance as a strategic tool. They actively recruit other species into their federation, offering technology and stability in exchange for contribution to the greater good. The philosophical framework that organizes Tau society and its expansion. The Tau's specific military advantage is their technology. Their ranged weaponry, pulse technology, plasma technology, advanced railgun systems, is in several respects more sophisticated than standard Imperial equipment. Their battlesuits, worn by the warrior caste, amplify individual combat capability to levels comparable to Space Marine armor. Their philosophy of war emphasizes combined arms coordination and the use of superior firepower from protected positions, which has proven effective against opponents who rely on close combat or mass charge tactics. What the Tau lack is any meaningful presence in, or relationship to, the warp. They are the only major species in the galaxy that does not produce psychic individuals, or produces them only in negligible quantities. They cannot navigate the warp in the way that most other species can. They cannot feel the presence of the Chaos Gods or respond to psychic phenomena the way that humans, Aeldari, and Orks can. This makes them essentially invisible to the specific cosmic forces that prey on psychically sensitive species, but it also limits their effective range. Tau ships cannot travel as quickly or as far as ships that use the warp. The Tau have fought several wars against the Imperium. The Damocles Crusade launched by the Imperium to check Tau expansion, and the subsequent Tau offensives that pushed back the Imperial response, and have consistently demonstrated that they are a more capable adversary than the Imperium's initial assessment of a young species would suggest. They are not the primary threat that Chaos or the Tyranids represent, but they are the most diplomatically sophisticated faction in the galaxy, and the one whose expansion could most easily be addressed by means other than war. The war for Armageddon, the Tyrannic Wars, the awakening Necron dynasties, the expanding Tau Empire. The Imperium of the late 41st millennium is managing all of these simultaneously, with no adequate resources for any of them. Each conflict consumes troops, ships, and material that are needed elsewhere. Each victory opens up a new vulnerability somewhere else. The Imperium is fighting the galaxy on every front, all the time, with institutions designed for a golden age of expansion that ended 10,000 years ago. And then the 13th Black Crusade began, and the galaxy broke. Sleep well. The final catastrophe of the 41st millennium is almost here. Welcome back. Let everything slow around you. We have arrived at the end of the 41st millennium. This is where 10,000 years of managed decline converge into a single catastrophe. The moment when everything that the Imperium had been fighting to prevent happened anyway, and the galaxy broke open. For 10,000 years, Cadia held. Cadia was the fortress world that guarded the Cadian Gate, the only stable corridor of real space leading out of the Eye of Terror into the wider galaxy. Every time the Chaos forces inside the Eye wanted to launch a major offensive, every time Abaddon the Despoiler organized his traitor legions and their demonic allies into a coordinated campaign against the Imperium, they had to come through the Cadian Gate, and at the Cadian Gate, Cadia waited. The world was covered in fortifications. Its population, the Cadians, who had lived on the edge of the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, were arguably the most militarily competent human population in the Imperium, producing soldiers of extraordinary quality in enormous numbers through a culture that treated military service as the fundamental purpose of existence. The Cadian shock troops were among the most respected regiments in the Imperial Guard. Their traditions, their discipline, their specific knowledge of fighting Chaos forces were products of living on the front line of the war against Chaos for their entire history as a civilization. Cadia was more than a fortress. On its surface, ancient pylons stood, structures of Necron origin, built millions of years ago before the Necrons entered their great sleep, and designed to suppress warp activity and maintain the barrier between real space and the Imperium. The Cadian pylons specifically suppressed the Eye of Terror, preventing it from expanding, keeping the warp real space overlap contained within the boundaries that had existed since the fall of the Aeldari. As long as the pylon stood, the Eye could not grow beyond its existing borders. The Chaos gods were contained, not defeated, not prevented from launching attacks, but limited in the territory they could directly occupy. Abaddon the Despoiler had known this for 10,000 years. His 13 Black Crusades had not all been aimed at the same target for the same reason. Some had achieved specific tactical objectives. Some had been designed to draw Imperial attention and resources. Some had focused on destroying specific ancient structures, Blackstone fortresses, Necron technologies, anything that maintained the structural integrity of the barrier between the warp and real space. Guilliman, reviewing the records of all 13 Black Crusades after his return, concluded that Abaddon had been running a 10,000-year strategic plan to weaken the warp barriers one structure at a time, with Cadia as the final target. The 13th Black Crusade was the culmination of everything. Abaddon assembled the largest Chaos force since the Horus Heresy. Every traitor legion contributed forces. Demon armies poured through the Eye of Terror alongside the Chaos Space Marines. Traitor Imperial Guard regiments, human soldiers who had turned from the Emperor over the millennia, marched with them. Dark Mechanicum war engines, corrupted versions of the Imperium's own technological force, supported the attack. The scale of the force that came through the Cadian Gate during the 13th Black Crusade exceeded anything that had threatened Cadia in its entire history. The Imperium responded with everything it could. Entire Space Marine chapters committed to the defense. Sisters of Battle, Astra Militarum regiments from dozens of worlds, the Imperial Navy with its fleets of warships, all converged on the Cadian system. The battle that followed was among the largest military engagements in the history of the 41st millennium, a conflict that consumed billions of lives across multiple worlds and orbital engagements and years of fighting. Cadia's surface held, the fortifications held, the Cadians and their allies held. And then Abaddon did something that no conventional military defense could address. He had a Blackstone fortress, one of the enormous ancient structures whose origins were connected to the same technology as the Cadian pylons, and he used it as a projectile. The Will of Eternity, one of the massive Blackstone fortresses that Abaddon had captured and turned to his purposes, was directed at Cadia's surface. The impact was catastrophic. The planet's structural integrity failed. Cadia began to break apart. The pylons shattered in the impact. With the pylons gone, the suppression effect that had kept the Eye of Terror contained for 10,000 years collapsed. And as the pylons collapsed, as something happened that no single event could have caused on its own. A cascade that had been building for millennia through all the preceding damage to the warp's barriers, through all of Abaddon's patient destruction of stabilizing structures, through the psychic pressures of 10,000 years of war and the specific accumulated damage of everything from Magnus's breach of the webway to the partial awakening of the Aeldari death god Inead, to the mass bloodshed of the Damocles Gulf. The warp tore, not in one place, not in the contained way that the Eye of Terror had always been a tear in reality, bounded and somewhat manageable. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Accursed Scar, ripped across the entire galaxy. From the Eye of Terror in the northwest, and connecting with every existing warp anomaly and weak point in the barrier between dimensions, all the way to the Hedex anomaly on the eastern fringe, an unbroken tear in reality that divided the Milky Way galaxy in half. The galaxy broke. On one side of the rift, the side that contained Terra and Ultramar and most of the Imperium's major administrative centers, the Astronomicon's light still reached. Warp travel was disrupted and dangerous, but possible. The Emperor's psychic beacon, maintained by the 1,000-soul sacrifice and the Golden Throne, still guided ships through the warp enough to maintain communication and movement, however compromised. This became known as the Imperium's Sanctus. On the other side, the half of the galaxy separated from Terra, from the Astronomicon's clear light, and from most of the Imperium's military and administrative infrastructure. Conditions became something close to the age of strife that had isolated humanity's colony worlds 5,000 years before the Great Crusade. Warp travel without the Astronomicon's guidance was extraordinarily dangerous. Communication across the rift was nearly impossible. Worlds on the far side found themselves cut off, unable to call for reinforcement, unable to receive orders, unable to coordinate defense with anyone outside their immediate region. This became known as the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium. For countless worlds in the Imperium Nihilus, the Great Rift was experienced not as a distant catastrophe, but as a direct and immediate one. The thinning of the barrier between the warp and real space, meant that demonic incursions became constant rather than exceptional. Demons were able to cross into the physical universe with a frequency and in numbers that had not been possible since the immediate aftermath of Slaanesh's birth. Warp storms engulfed systems. Planets that had been stable for centuries suddenly found themselves in the middle of psychic maelstroms. The laws of physics became unreliable in the vicinity of the rift. The period immediately following the Great Rift's opening was called the Noctis Aeterna, the eternal night. The Astronomican's light, disrupted by the psychic shock of the rift's formation, flickered and dimmed. For a period measured in months across the Imperium, warp travel became almost impossible even on the Sanctus side. Ships were lost. Reinforcements that had been en route simply vanished. Worlds that were under assault when the Noctis Aeterna began faced their attackers without any possibility of help arriving. But the Astronomican had not gone out. The Emperor, whatever his state on the Golden Throne, was not dead, and the psychic machinery that sustained the Astronomican continued to function, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. As the initial shock of the rift's formation passed, the Astronomican's light recovered somewhat, not to its previous clarity, but enough to allow navigation by experienced navigators willing to take the risk. And something else happened in the period around the Great Rift's opening. Something that the Imperium had not expected and had not planned for. Robot Guilliman returned. The circumstances of Guilliman's awakening from stasis involved several intersecting threads. An ancient Archmagos Dominus of the Adeptus Mechanicus, named Belisarius Cawl, who had been working for 10,000 years on a secret project that Guilliman himself had commissioned before his wounding. A mysterious alliance with a faction of Aeldari called the Inari, who followed the newly awakened Aeldari death god Inead, and the specific moment when the stasis field that had kept Guilliman suspended between life and death for 10 millennia was finally opened. Guilliman woke. He was wounded. The psychic and physical damage from Fulgrim's attack had not healed during the stasis, and his recovery required direct intervention from the Aeldari and the specific application of Cawl's work. But he was conscious. He was functional. And within a very short time, he was appalled. 10,000 years of history had produced an Imperium that Guilliman recognized only in its worst features. The institutional decay he had tried to prevent, the religious fanaticism replacing the rational governance he had established, the bureaucracy consuming the resources that should have been defending actual threats, the administratum that he had designed as an efficient governing body had become a bloated organism that generated paperwork faster than it generated solutions. The Adeptus Mechanicus had ossified into a religion that treated innovation as heresy, preventing the Imperium from developing the technologies it needed to survive. The High Lords of Terror, the governing council he had established, had become political actors pursuing institutional interests rather than genuinely governing. He was horrified, and then he was angry, and then he got to work. The Primarch of the Ultramarines was resurrected, fought his way to Terra, and claimed the position of Lord Commander of the Imperium, the highest civilian military authority in the Emperor's absence. The High Lords, who had been operating with effective autonomy for 10,000 years, were not immediately thrilled. Several of them were removed from their positions when Guilliman determined that their institutional priorities had diverged sufficiently from the Imperium's survival to constitute a meaningful problem. Guilliman also received Belisarius Call's project. Over 10,000 years had the ancient Archmagos had been working on the commission Guilliman had given him before his wounding to improve the Space Marine. The result was the Primaris Space Marine, a new pattern of Astartes produced through a different and more robust process than the original Space Marine creation, with enhanced biology that exceeded the original design in several measurable ways. Where a standard Space Marine had 1 extra heart, the Primaris had 3. Where a standard Space Marine had specific physical limits, the Primaris exceeded them. They were deployed from the beginning of Guilliman's response to the Great Rift as the vanguard of his reconstruction effort. The Indomitus Crusade launched. Guilliman gathered the new Primaris Marines, the surviving forces of the Adeptus Custodes who rarely operated beyond terror, the elements of the Sisters of Silence, and forces drawn from dozens of Space Marine chapters, and began the campaign to reconnect the Imperium's scattered worlds and push back the chaos forces that the Great Rift had unleashed. The Indomitus Crusade was not a solution to the Imperium's problems. It was a response, an attempt to prevent the immediate catastrophe from becoming the complete collapse. Thousands of worlds were reached, reinforced, pulled back from the edge of being lost. But thousands more could not be reached, and the rift showed no sign of closing. The demons that had been pouring through it showed no sign of stopping, and Abaddon, from the Eye of Terror, was not done. The Plague Wars followed shortly after. The forces of Nurgle, empowered by the Great Rift's opening, launched a campaign against Guilliman's own domain of Ultramar. The campaign was specifically designed to strike at what Guilliman valued most: the civilization he had built, the realm he had protected. He personally led the defense of Ultramar, fighting alongside Mortarion, the demon Primarch of the Death Guard, who had once been his brother, in a duel that carried the weight of 10,000 years of history. Ultramar survived. Mortarion was driven back, but the victory was defensive. The Plague Wars demonstrated that Guilliman could protect what he could personally reach, and that the galaxy's problems were larger than any single Primarch could address, regardless of how capable that Primarch was. The galaxy of the current era, the Era Indomitus, the 42nd millennium, is a place of unprecedented crisis. The Great Rift divides everything. The Imperium fights on 100 fronts simultaneously. Chaos, Tyranids, Necrons, Orks, and Tau all press their advantages in a galaxy whose defenses are thinner than they have been since the Horus Heresy. Guilliman works to repair institutions that have been degenerating for 10,000 years, while simultaneously fighting the wars that those degenerating institutions failed to prevent. And on the Golden Throne, the Emperor persists. Whether the Emperor is aware of what has happened, whether he has a plan, whether the 10,000 years of sacrifice, the 1,000 souls per day, the navigators guided by his psychic light, the custodian standing watch at the foot of his throne, are building towards something, or simply sustaining a state that was never meant to be permanent. is the central unanswered question of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Sleep well. The final part of this story remains. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow. The Great Rift opened. Guilliman returned. The Indomitus Crusade launched, and the galaxy did not stabilize. This part covers the current era, the Era Indomitus of the 42nd millennium, and what the Warhammer 40,000 universe looks like when every threat is active simultaneously, and the Imperium is fighting a war it cannot fully win on 100 fronts at once. The Psychic Awakening. In the years following the Great Rift's opening, something unprecedented began to happen across the galaxy. The number of psychers, human individuals born with the ability to touch the warp and channel its energy, increased dramatically. Not gradually, not as a statistical blip, but in numbers and concentrations that overwhelmed the black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica and the fleet responsible for collecting and processing the billions of psychers that human civilization produces every generation. The Psychic Awakening, as it became known in Imperial records, was the Great Rift's most far-reaching consequence beyond the physical disruption of the galaxy. The thinning of the barrier between the warp and real space that the rift represented meant that psychic energy flowed more freely into the physical universe than it ever had. People who had been born with minor latent psychic potential suddenly developed active gifts. People who had been minor psychers became significantly more powerful. The rate of psychic mutation, psychic manifestation, and spontaneous psychic disaster increased across thousands of worlds simultaneously. For the Imperium, this was a crisis with no easy solution. The process for handling psychers, collecting them via the black ships, testing and evaluating them at Terra, either training the useful ones for service or sacrificing the unstable ones to the Emperor's sustenance, was already operating beyond its design capacity before the Psychic Awakening. The sudden increase in psyker numbers pushed the system past any reasonable limit. Worlds that could not be reached by black ships began developing uncontrolled psyker populations. Cults formed around psychers whose gifts were impressive, but whose stability was questionable. The rate of demonic possession, the specific catastrophe that occurs when a psyker's psychic defenses fail and a warp entity occupies their body, increased proportionally. For other factions, the Psychic Awakening had different implications. The Aeldari, already a psychically sensitive species, found their Fasha's precognitive abilities enhanced, but also more dangerous. Seeing further into possible futures meant being exposed to psychic energies of proportionally greater intensity. The Orks, whose psychic specialists called Weird Boys channel the collective psychic energy of nearby Orks, found their Weird Boys becoming more powerful and less stable in equal measure. Even the Chaos War bands inside the Eye of Terror were affected. The increased flow of psychic energy into the warp translated into increased power for Chaos Sorcerers, but also increased volatility in the warp itself. The Psychic Awakening was understood by most who analyzed it as a symptom rather than a cause. The galaxy was changing in ways that psychic sensitivity expressed most immediately, but whose roots went deeper than the number of psychers being born. Something fundamental about the relationship between the warp and the physical universe had shifted. whether permanently or temporarily, remained unclear. The Lion returns. Among the many extraordinary events of the Era Indomitus, one had a specific significance for the Space Marine community that was difficult to overstate: the return of Lion L. Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels. The Dark Angels, the first Space Marine Legion, sons of the first Primarch found during the Great Crusade, had carried a secret since the Horus Heresy. Not all of their legion had remained loyal during the heresy. A significant number had turned traitor, motivated by specific circumstances on their homeworld of Caliban, and had been destroyed when Caliban itself was torn apart in the aftermath of the conflict. The survivors of this internal betrayal, the Fallen, as they were known to the Dark Angels, were scattered across time and space by the warp energies that destroyed Caliban. The Dark Angels' obsessive hunt for the Fallen, the capture and interrogation of their former brothers, was the central organizing purpose of their chapter and of the successor chapters collectively known as the Unforgiven. Lion L. Johnson had been believed lost since the Horus Heresy, not killed in battle, simply absent. The records of his last known location had him on Caliban when the planet was destroyed, and no confirmed sightings had placed him anywhere since. The Dark Angels chapter master believed him dead. Most of the Imperium, and on the rare occasions when they thought about it at all, agreed. He had been in the rock. The Dark Angels' mobile fortress monastery, built from the largest surviving fragment of the shattered world of Caliban, had been carrying their Primarch in a state of unconscious healing for 10,000 years. He had been injured in the final battle on Caliban, badly enough that his enhanced physiology had shut down all non-essential functions to focus on repair, and he had simply been there, asleep in the deepest levels of the rock, while his sons hunted the Fallen and fought the Imperium's wars, and slowly forgot what their father had looked like. He woke during the Era Indomitus. The specific circumstances of his awakening are bound up with events connected to the Chaos forces pressing on the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium on the far side of the Great Rift. Guilliman, who had established contact with the Dark Angels' leadership, learned of the Lion's return with whatever passed for surprise in a being who had been awake for 10,000 years, less than the emotional scale of that discovery required. The Lion's return added another Primarch to the active forces available to the Imperium. Like Guilliman, he woke to a galaxy he recognized in its broad outlines, but not in its specifics. A galaxy where the institutions he had known were corrupted or transformed, where his sons had grown in his absence into something that both represented and diverged from what he had intended, and where the war was larger and more desperate than the one he had been part of before his long sleep. Unlike Guilliman, whose response to the state of the Imperium was visible frustration and immediate administrative intervention, the Lion's response was characteristically more enigmatic. He had always been the most secretive of the Primarchs, the one whose inner workings were least accessible even to those closest to him. He returned with purposes that he did not fully explain, took actions whose significance was not immediately clear, and began operating in the Imperium Nihilus, the dark Imperium that Guilliman could not easily reach. With the specific focus of a person, who understood something about the current situation that others had not yet grasped. The Necron Pariah Nexus, or while the Imperium managed the crisis of the Great Rift and the Indomitus Crusade, the Necrons, whose return to active participation in galactic events had been building through the late 41st millennium, undertook a project that represented one of the most significant threats to human psychic capability in recorded history. The Silent King, having returned and begun unifying the Necron dynasties under the strategic framework that prioritized the Tyranid threat, also pursued a more immediately concerning objective: the Pariah Nexus, a region of space in which the Necrons deployed their Pariah technology at an unprecedented scale, became a zone where the psychic connection between humans and the warp was severed. The stilling, as it was called by those who experienced it, was a condition in which psychers lost their abilities, in which even ordinary humans felt the absence of the warp's background presence in ways that produced psychological effects ranging from vague unease to complete psychological breakdown. The practical military consequence of the stilling was that entire Imperial Guard regiments stationed within the Pariah Nexus became non-functional, not because they were killed or defeated, but because the psychological effects of the stilling on soldiers who had spent their lives in a galaxy where the warp was an ambient presence made it impossible for them to maintain military effectiveness. An Astra Militarum regiment, cut off from the warp's background influence, unable to receive or send astropathic communications, unable to use psychic support, became profoundly disoriented in ways that no amount of training or discipline could fully address. The Pariah Nexus represented the Necrons at their most ambitious in terms of reshaping the fundamental conditions of reality to serve their purposes. Guilliman dispatched forces including Belisarius Cawl and elements of the Adeptus Custodes to counter the Nexus. Recognizing that if the Necrons could extend this technology across a wider region, the Imperium's psychic infrastructure would be compromised at a level that could be more devastating than direct military assault. The ongoing Tyrannic wars. The Tyranid threat, which had been building since the first contact with High Fleet Behemoth in 745 M41, had not diminished with the opening of the Great Rift. The three primary High Fleets had been blunted but not destroyed. In the Era Indomitus, new tendrils of High Fleet Leviathan and new High Fleets designated by the Imperium's Ordo Xenos continued pressing from the galactic south and east. The Fourth Tyrannic War, the conflict that defines the current state of the setting in the most recent editions of the Warhammer 40,000 rules, saw the Tyranid threat reach its most intense point since Behemoth. High Fleet Leviathan, which had survived and adapted from its previous encounters with Imperial defenses, launched a renewed offensive that reached into the heart of Imperial space in ways that previous Hive fleets had not managed. Space Marine chapters and Astra Militarum forces committed to the war on a scale that stretched the Imperium's resources beyond their limits. The specific horror of the Fourth Tyrannic War was the Tyranids' demonstrated ability to learn from each engagement and adapt in ways that rendered previously effective tactics obsolete within the span of a single campaign. Weapons and strategies that had worked against previous hive fleets were countered by new bioforms that the hive mind had developed specifically in response to those strategies. The war was not simply a military problem. It was an evolutionary arms race being run in real time, against an opponent whose rate of adaptation exceeded anything the Imperium's own technological development could match. The Silent King's calculation that the Tyranids represented a threat to all life in the galaxy, and that the Necrons' interests required addressing them, led to the most unusual strategic arrangement in the current era. The beginning of a functional, if deeply uncomfortable, cooperation between Necron dynasties and certain Imperial forces against specific Tyranid incursions. No alliance was formally declared, no treaty was signed, but in specific theaters, on specific worlds, Necron warriors and Space Marines fought on the same side against the same Hive fleet, and then separated without further engagement. The galaxy's politics in the Era Indomitus were too complex for simple categories. The Chaos Wars continued. The Great Rift had not simply opened a wound in reality, it had created a highway, and the chaos forces that poured through it in the immediate aftermath of the Rift's opening were followed by more organized campaigns, as the traitor legions and their demonic allies took advantage of the changed conditions to prosecute the Long War, with a ferocity that had not been possible since the Horus Heresy. The Thousand Sons, Magnus the Red's Legion, who had become the masters of chaos sorcery, and who served Tzeentch with the specific brilliance of beings who had spent 10,000 years in the warped psychic environment, launched attacks on the Space Wolves' home system of Fenris that caused permanent changes to that world. The Space Wolves, who had never forgiven the Thousand Sons for the events of the burning of Prospero 10,000 years before, responded with every resource they had. The conflict between these two legions, one loyal, one traitor, both carrying grudges that predated the heresy, became one of the defining campaigns of the current era. The Death Guard, Mortarian's legion, servants of Nurgle, conducted the Plague Wars against Guilliman's Ultramar, as described in the previous part, and while they were driven back, they did not stop. The forces of Nurgle continued to press against the Imperium's worlds with the specific patience of a god whose fundamental nature was the inevitability of decay and the indifference of disease. Plague planets, worlds consumed by Nurgle's blessings to the point where they functioned as living demonic realms in real space, multiplied in the territory near the Great Rift. Abaddon himself did not stop with Cadia, the War Master of Chaos, and whose 10,000-year strategic project had finally achieved one of its primary goals with the destruction of the Cadian pylons and the opening of the Rift, continued to operate. His Black Legion remained the most coherent military force among the traitor legions, the only one that had successfully transcended the specific identity of a single Chaos God to become a genuinely unified Chaos military organization, where the other traitor legions were increasingly defined by their specific patron, the Thousand Sons by Tzeentch, the Death Guard by Nurgle, the World Eaters by Khorne, the Emperor's Children by Slaanesh. The Black Legion served all four and none exclusively, giving Abaddon flexibility that his fellow Chaos commanders did not possess. The state of every world. What the Era Indomitus looks like at the individual world level, below the level of galaxy-spanning campaigns and Primarchs returning from stasis, is a condition of constant grinding, barely managed crisis. on every inhabited world in the Imperium. The tithes of troops and resources continue to be collected to fuel distant wars. On every world, the Ministorum maintains the imperial faith through institutions whose relationship to genuine theological conviction varies enormously, but whose social function in maintaining the population's connection to the Imperium's identity remains essential. On every world, the local planetary defense forces, the PDF, maintain what order they can against threats that range from criminal insurgency to chaos cult infiltration to alien incursion. Most of the Imperium's million worlds will never see a space marine. They will be defended by ordinary humans with ordinary weapons against whatever threats come to them, with the knowledge that if those threats exceed the PDF's capacity, help may or may not arrive in time depending on how many other crises are competing for the same assets. The Imperium is, at its heart, billions of ordinary people trying to survive in a galaxy that is fundamentally hostile to their survival, sustained by faith in an emperor who cannot speak to them, and protected by institutions that range from genuinely dedicated to profoundly corrupt. They endure. That is, in the 42nd millennium, still the most that can be said. They endure. And on the golden throne, the Emperor remains. 1,000 souls per day. The Astronomican's light. The custodians at their eternal watch. The machinery that has sustained him for 10,000 years, maintained by the Adeptus Mechanicus priests who understand only portions of how it functions. The golden throne itself is failing. The technology that maintains it was not designed for 10,000-year operation, and those who understand its mechanisms believe it cannot function indefinitely. What happens if the golden throne fails is a question that the Imperium does not ask formally, because the institutional response to that question would be too destabilizing to allow. But individuals ask it. Belisarius Call, who has studied more of the Imperium's ancient technology than perhaps any other living being, asks it. Guilliman asks it. The High Lords of Terror, in their private moments, ask it. The answer to what happens if the Golden Throne fails is not something that has been established clearly in the lore. It might be the end of the Astronomican, and therefore of warp travel for humanity. It might be the physical death of the Emperor. It might be something else entirely. A transformation rather than an ending. A release of the psychic energy that has been accumulating in the Emperor's body for 10,000 years in ways that change the nature of the warp itself. There are those who believe the Emperor is not simply surviving on the Golden Throne, but growing, accumulating psychic power towards something, and that his emergence from the throne will be the most significant event since the heresy. There are those who believe he is simply dying, slowly. I maintain past the point that is kind by the machinery and the sacrifices, because the alternative, the Imperium without the Astronomican, without the psychic beacon that makes interstellar civilization possible, is something that cannot be contemplated. The galaxy of the Era Indomitus is a place where every major faction is simultaneously at the height of its activity and facing existential threat. The Imperium fights on every front. The Chaos Gods pursue their great game, with the advantage of a galaxy more open to the warp than it has ever been. The Necrons awaken to a galaxy they believe is theirs by right of conquest, 60 million years old. The Tyranids consume and adapt an approach. The Orks fight because fighting is what they are, as the Aeldari pursue their people's survival with the specific ruthlessness of a dying civilization. And through all of it, the ordinary human inhabitants of the galaxy, the billions of farmers and soldiers and artisans and pilgrims and functionaries who make up the actual population of the Imperium, continue to live their lives in the margins of these enormous conflicts, mostly unaware of the full scale of what surrounds them, trusting in the Emperor they cannot see and the Space Marines they will probably never meet, and the basic continuity of existence that has somehow persisted through 10,000 years of war. Sleep well. One final part remains. The meaning of this universe awaits. Welcome back. This is the last part. We have travelled 65 million years, from the war in heaven to the Era Indomitus, from the Old Ones seeding the galaxy with life to the Great Rift tearing it in half, from the Emperor's birth out of 1,000 sacrificed shamans to his 10,000-year vigil on the Golden Throne, from the Primarchs' creation to their corruption, their deaths, their long sleeps, and their returns. This final part does something different. It stops to ask what all of this is actually about, because Warhammer 40,000 is not simply a military history. It is not simply an exercise in scale, though the scale is genuinely extraordinary, measured in millions of years and trillions of deaths and civilizations that rose and fell before humanity had learned to walk upright. It is a universe that was built with a specific emotional and philosophical project in mind. An understanding that project changes how you hear everything that came before it. The Grimdark. The tagline for Warhammer 40,000 has been consistent since the game's earliest editions. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. This is not a description. It is a thesis. The universe was designed to be one in which improvement is impossible, where every institution is corrupt, every solution creates new problems, every victory is temporary, and every defeat is permanent. The Imperium is not presented as a good civilization defending itself against evil. The Imperium is presented as a vast, brutal, authoritarian theocracy that commits atrocities at a scale that would be incomprehensible in any other context, as simply to maintain its existence against threats that are also, in their own ways, comprehensible and even sympathetic when viewed from the right angle. The Chaos Gods are real. The Orks thrive in war because they were made to. The Necrons want what they were always promised and were deceived out of. The Tyranids are simply doing what life does, consuming resources and expanding at a scale that makes them monsters only because of what they consume. The Aeldari are a dying people trying to survive the consequence of their civilization's own worst impulses. Every faction has a reason. None of them are simply evil. All of them are fighting simultaneously against each other and against the fundamental nature of a universe that does not care whether any of them survive. And the Imperium, humanity's great project, the civilization that the Emperor bled to build, is perhaps the most honest of all. It is not good. It burns worlds that could be saved. It executes billions of people for the wrong beliefs. It maintains itself through terror and sacrifice and an institutional inertia so profound that it cannot change even when it knows it must. and it is humanity's best available option. The galaxy without the Imperium would be worse, not better, for most of the humans who currently live under it. The horror of the Imperium is not that it is evil, it is that it is necessary, the Emperor's dream and what became of it. The Emperor wanted something specific. He wanted to build a civilization where humanity was safe, genuinely safe, not from the ordinary threats of disease or poverty or political conflict, but from the warp, from the chaos gods, and from the specific catastrophe that awaited any psychically active species that did not build adequate defenses against the psychic dimension that underlies physical reality. He had a plan for this that was more sophisticated than the Great Crusade. The Webway project, the secret work being done beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, was designed to give humanity direct access to the Webway, the extra-dimensional transport network the old ones had built and the Aeldari had perfected. If humanity had the Webway, they could travel between worlds without entering the warp, without exposing themselves to the chaos gods with every journey, without needing the Astronomicon, whose existence required the Emperor to remain psychically active, which required the Golden Throne, which required 1,000 souls per day in perpetual sacrifice. The Webway project was destroyed when Magnus the Red, trying to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption, used forbidden psychic power to reach Terra, and accidentally tore a hole in the wards protecting the project. Demons flooded in. The project had to be abandoned. The Emperor moved to the Golden Throne to hold the breach closed psychically, and was still there when Horus came to Terra and wounded him beyond the point of physical recovery. The Emperor's dream died because his son was trying to save him. This is the tragedy at the center of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Not that the Chaos Gods were too powerful, not that the Primarchs were too flawed, not that the Great Crusade was too ambitious, but that the specific moment of failure came from a genuine act of care. Magnus loved the Emperor. He broke the rules because he believed the Emperor needed to know about Horus's betrayal more than the rules needed to be followed. And in that moment of love and poor judgment, everything changed. The 10,000 years that followed were the consequence, not of evil, but of a terrible mistake made by someone who was trying to do good. What Guilliman understands. Robert Guilliman is the only Primarch who has survived his return long enough to look at the 41st millennium with clear eyes and then continue to function. Lion Eljonson has returned, but the full nature of his assessment is still unfolding. Guilliman has been working within the Imperium structures for long enough now to understand them in the way that only time and experience can provide. What he understands, and what he has stated directly in the law, is that the Imperium is a failure. Not a failure that can be dismissed or abandoned, because there is nothing to replace it with, but a failure nonetheless. The secular, rational, scientifically minded civilization that the Emperor tried to build has become its opposite. A superstitious theocracy that worships the man who most specifically did not want to be worshipped, that suppresses the scientific innovation that was supposed to be its greatest strength, that maintains itself through the scale of its human population rather than through excellence or wisdom. Guilliman has also stated something that is more disturbing than the assessment of failure. He is not certain the Emperor is still the Emperor. The being on the golden throne has been in that state for 10,000 years. Whatever consciousness remains, whatever awareness persists in a body that is not dead but not alive in any conventional sense, sustained by the psychic sacrifice of millions of people over 100 centuries, whether that is still the person who dreamed the Imperium, or something that has grown in the warp during that time into something different, is not a question Guilliman can answer. And if the Emperor is not the Emperor, if the being on the golden throne is something that has transcended or drifted from the man who built everything, then the worship directed at him, the billion prayers per day from every corner of the Imperium, the entire institutional and spiritual framework of the imperial cult, is either aimed at something real that does not match the target, or is simply the most elaborate misdirected prayer in human history. And these are not comfortable thoughts. Guilliman has them anyway. He is, among everything else, honest. The question of hope. Warhammer 40,000 is often described as a setting without hope. A universe where everything is getting worse and nothing can be fixed. And the ending, whenever it comes, will be catastrophic. This is an accurate description of the surface structure of the setting. But it is not the whole truth. The setting survives in the cultural sense because it produces stories of individual heroism that are meaningful specifically because of how dark the context is. A space marine holding a line against a demon army on a world that no one else cares about, for reasons that have nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the specific person the space marine is. This story is compelling, not despite the grimdark setting, but because of it. When the galaxy is this dark, the individual who chooses to hold the line anyway means something. The ordinary soldier who is not superhuman, who does not have power armor or psychic gifts, or the ability to heal from wounds that should be fatal, who stands at a checkpoint on a world that no one important has ever heard of and does their job. This person also means something, perhaps more than the Space Marine, in a universe where superhuman capability is possible. The ordinary person's choice to keep going in a universe designed to break ordinary people is the quiet heroism that the setting depends on for its emotional center. The Emperor built the Imperium for people like this. Not for the Primarchs, not for the Space Marines, not for the High Lords of Terror. For the billions of ordinary humans who, without the Imperium's protection, however brutal and imperfect that protection is, would have been consumed by the warp or destroyed by aliens or simply ended in the cold between stars. The Imperium is terrible. It is also what stands between those billions of people and something worse. This is the tension that makes the setting worth caring about. Not the certainty of either doom or salvation, but the genuine uncertainty of a universe where individual choices matter even if the outcome of those choices is not guaranteed to be good, and where the meaning of a life is not determined by whether it succeeded in any measurable sense, but by what it chose to be, what the Emperor knew. The Emperor of mankind, in his 10,000-year silence on the Golden Throne, has not communicated directly with anyone in a way that could be clearly attributed to him, rather than to the religious projections of the billions who pray to him. But the lore contains several things that suggest he planned further than anyone currently living understands. The commission he gave Belisarius call to improve the Space Marine, a project that took 10,000 years to produce the Primaris Marines, was given before his wounding. He knew he would be incapacitated. He planned for it. He left specific tools in specific places for the people who would come later. Melina's creation, if she existed in this universe, would be this kind of planning. But in 40,000, and the equivalent is scattered across the setting. Organizations whose original purpose was known only to the Emperor, and that continue to function in ways that serve purposes no one currently alive understands. Technologies maintained in working order despite no one knowing what they are for. Specific individuals in specific places whose presence is the result of guidance that cannot be traced to any currently living source. Whether this adds up to a plan that is still unfolding, or to the scattered remnants of a plan that was broken by the heresy and has not been coherently operative for 10,000 years, is one of the central unresolved questions of the setting. The people within the universe cannot answer it. The creators of the universe have chosen not to answer it definitively, because the uncertainty is more powerful than any resolution would be. What this universe is for. Warhammer 40,000 is 65 million years of history in service of a very simple question. What does it mean to be human when everything around you is trying to unmake you? Not the superhuman version of that question. The Primarchs version, the Space Marines version, the being built to be a weapon version, the ordinary version. What does it mean for the billion people on a hive world that has never been visited by a Space Marine and has no strategic significance and will never appear in anyone's official history to continue to build their lives, raise their children, maintain their faith or abandon it, love the people around them, and face whatever comes at them with whatever they have? The Grimdark is not the point. The Grimdark is the context. The point is the person who keeps going inside it. The Emperor understood this. It was why he was human. Why the shamans chose to create him as a human being rather than as something else. Humanity's specific value in the galaxy, its specific contribution to the cosmos, is not its psychic power or its military capability or its technological achievement. It is the specific quality of choosing to continue in circumstances that should produce despair. The Chaos Gods feed on human emotion. They were built from it. Every feeling a human being has ever had at sufficient intensity feeds the things that are trying to destroy humanity. Fear feeds Khorne's aggression. Despair feeds Nurgle's rot. Ambition and manipulation feed Tzeentch's scheming. Pleasure and excess feed Slanesh's hunger. The warp is made of human experience. And yet humans continue to experience, continue to feel, continue to love and hate and hope and despair and fight and rest and love again. The Chaos Gods cannot win by making humans feel. They need humans to feel nothing but the specific emotions that feed each specific god. What sustains humanity against the warp is the full complexity of human experience. The mixture of feelings that cannot be reduced to any one Chaos God's domain. That constitutes something the warp cannot fully process or consume. The Emperor on the Golden Throne is not simply sustaining the Astronomicon. He is, in the understanding of those who have thought most carefully about what he is doing, holding something, protecting something, and channeling the psychic energy of the billions who pray to him into something that the current Imperium cannot fully see or understand. Whether this is building toward an apotheosis, a transformation of the Emperor into something new, the birth of a new Aeldari equivalent entity from human psychic energy, or whether it is simply maintenance, survival, the holding of a position until something changes, is not known. What is known is that the Emperor chose to stay, that in the moment when Horus lay defeated and the Emperor could have died fully and completely, he did not. He had himself placed on the throne. He continued. Whatever his reasons, and the law suggests they were complex and not all benevolent, and that the Emperor's relationship to his own role in human history was more complicated than simple heroism. He made the choice to continue. In a universe defined by the grinding horror of endless war, that choice to continue is the closest thing to hope the setting provides. This has been the entire Warhammer 40,000 timeline. From the moment of the universe's creation, when the Citan emerged as living energy from the first stellar formation and the universe had barely begun. Through the Old Ones and their great project of nurturing life across a galaxy. Through the war in heaven that broke everything the Old Ones built and filled the warp with the psychic residue of 60 million years of death. Through the Aeldari's rise and fall and the birth of Slaanesh from their own excess. Through the long sleep of the Necrons in their tomb worlds. Through humanity's slow climb from the plains of prehistoric terror to the stars. Through the Emperor's 10,000-year walk across human history, building and waiting and preparing. Through the Great Crusade's golden age and the Horus Heresy's catastrophic betrayal. Through 10,000 years of the age of Imperium, every Black Crusade, every tyrannic war, every Necron awakening, every Ork war, every ordinary person on every ordinary world simply trying to survive another day. Through the Fall of Cadia and the opening of the Great Rift and Guilliman's return and the Era Indomitus and the wars that are ongoing right now in the 42nd millennium. As this story is being told, the galaxy is dark. It has been dark for a very long time. And in that darkness, people keep going. That is what Warhammer 40,000 is about. Good night. This has been the entire Warhammer 40,000 timeline, told slowly, for the hours when sleep is far away. Rest well. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there are also people fighting it, and that is not nothing.